Welcome back. This is Midnight Crime. If you enjoy falling asleep to these stories, feel free to like the video and subscribe. And before we begin, what time is it where you are, and where are you listening from tonight? Alright, let's head straight into our first story. Case 1. At 2:13 a.m., a call reached dispatch and stayed connected for 47 seconds. No voice, no background noise. When officers arrived, the apartment lights were on, and something inside had already been moved. The hallway smelled faintly of damp carpet, a muted, clinging scent that made Detective Harper pause at the threshold. The apartment door was slightly ajar, its knob cold under his gloved hand. The lights inside cast long shadows across the floorboards, soft but uneven, as if someone had moved the fixtures without care. He stepped in slowly, boots whispering against the laminate, and noticed the faint sheen of moisture on the kitchen counter. A glass of water had been set down and forgotten, rings left like fingerprints frozen in time. On the living room table, papers had been stacked differently than Harper expected. A small notebook lay open, its pages flattened under the weight of an empty mug. On the floor, a corner of a carpet was lifted, revealing a dark smudge on the tile beneath. He crouched, careful not to disturb anything, and traced the shape with his fingertip. It was too irregular to be a shadow. The stain was older, settled into the grout. He walked toward the bedroom. The bedspread was partially pulled back, but not in a manner consistent with sleep. A drawer was half open, its contents slightly shifted, suggesting someone had rifled through it quickly, then stopped. Harper's flashlight beam caught a small item on the floor, a single earring, delicate, tarnished at the clasp, lying near the corner of the dresser. He tucked it carefully into an evidence bag. From the balcony, the city outside was quiet. Streetlights reflected on wet pavement, a light drizzle misting the air. Across the street, the neon sign of a 24-hour laundromat flickered, buzzing softly. Inside the apartment, the smell of faint cigarette smoke lingered, though no ashtray or cigarettes were visible. Harper wondered if it had come from a visitor, or if it clung to the walls, embedded in the paint over years. In the kitchen, a refrigerator hummed low and steady. The magnets on its door were slightly askew, one loose enough to dangle and sway with his movement. A calendar hung above, pages flipped to the current month, but the squares marked with pencil had been smudged. Small notations, numbers, letters, brief words, were indecipherable at first glance. Harper traced them slowly, thinking, noticing patterns that didn't quite make sense. Some dates crossed out, some circled, a dash here and there. He moved toward the bathroom. The mirror was streaked with condensation, tiny drops forming random trails down the glass. A faint metallic scent lingered in the air, and he paused at the edge of the sink. The faucet handle had been turned slightly, water droplets clinging to its chrome surface, but the sink itself was dry. Harper touched the edge of the basin, noting the subtle warmth of recently running water. From the living room, he heard a faint hum, almost imperceptible, like a refrigerator in the distance, but there was no appliance running there. He turned the corner slowly, shining his light across the room. A small desk sat under the window, the blinds uneven, a shadowed triangle of streetlight cutting across a stack of unopened letters. One envelope had a torn corner, a tiny crease suggesting it had been opened then resealed. Down the hall, a closet door was slightly open. Harper nudged it with his shoulder. Inside, coats hung neatly, but one was askew, as if hastily tossed. A pair of shoes at the bottom were mismatched in style, one polished, one scuffed. He bent down, noticing a faint trail of dust disturbed around them. Each step forward, each careful touch, seemed to reveal another subtle shift. An object moved, a surface altered, a scent that didn't belong. Outside, a neighbor's window cracked open, letting in the faint murmur of an air conditioner and the occasional bark of a dog. Harper could hear his own breathing in the quiet, measured, almost synchronized with the soft ticking of the wall clock. He paused, letting his eyes sweep the apartment once more, absorbing its small anomalies. A cushion slightly off-center on the couch, a kitchen towel folded oddly, the hinge of a cabinet door loose and squeaking when nudged. He made notes on his pad, careful, slow, deliberately noting the incongruities, the lifted carpet, the open drawer, the earring, the smudged calendar, the slight warmth of the sink. Each detail alone seemed inconsequential, but together they formed an uneven rhythm, a quiet tension that pressed against the stillness of the apartment. Harper knew this was only the beginning. There was more to see, more to sense. He lingered in the living room a moment longer, eyes drawn to the small stack of magazines on the coffee table. One was turned face down, its glossy cover catching the soft yellow light. As he reached for it, he noticed a faint imprint of fingerprints, almost imperceptible, pressed into the cover. He turned it slowly, careful not to smudge them further, and saw the magazine beneath had a photograph marked with a crease, something deliberately folded over. The apartment was silent except for the faint hum of the city outside, the low vibration of lights, and Harper's measured movements. Every object seemed to whisper a question, every shadow hinted at a presence, and every subtle clue teased a narrative that had yet to emerge. He walked slowly toward the window, letting his gaze drift outward, knowing that the answers, if they came, would reveal themselves quietly, piece by piece. The night held its breath around him. Harper moved toward the hallway closet again, lingering near the edge of its open door. Something about the way the coats hung felt deliberate, like a rhythm interrupted. He reached in and ran a gloved hand along the shoulder of a wool coat, feeling the texture, the weight, and then the faint bump of something hidden beneath the fabric. A folded piece of paper slipped silently to the floor. He picked it up, holding it under the flashlight. The handwriting was small, cramped, hurried in parts, neat in others. A series of numbers, a few letters, and what looked like times, circled and underlined in pencil, all on a scrap of lined paper torn from a notebook. He set it carefully in his pocket and stepped further down the hall, toward a small study tucked into the corner of the apartment. The door creaked softly when he nudged it open. Inside, the room smelled faintly of ink and dust. A single desk lamp was turned on, its light spilling across an open laptop. The screen was black, but the keyboard had small smudges, like someone had typed and then pressed their palms against it. Harper touched the keys gently. They were warm. On the floor beneath the desk, a scattering of loose receipts caught the light. They were all from different locations, each one time-stamped in a tight, precise print. Grocery stores, a hardware shop, a cafe that had closed weeks ago. The edges of some were curled and damp, as though handled in haste. Harper bent over to line them up on the desk. Patterns started to emerge, not immediately obvious, but a subtle sequence, a rhythm connecting place, date, and amount. He heard a faint noise from the kitchen, a soft scrape, like a chair being nudged along the tile. Harper's flashlight cut across the room, illuminating a chair partially pulled out from the table. A mug sat on the counter beside it, the rim wet. He leaned in, noticing a tiny fragment of something dark at the bottom of the mug. like a shard of glass or residue from a spilled drink. He tapped it with a gloved fingertip. It was solid, small, and heavy enough to have fallen from somewhere else. Moving toward the bedroom, Harper noticed the curtains had been drawn unevenly, one panel hanging lower than the other, its hem brushing the carpet. He lifted it slowly. A small envelope, tucked between the folds of the fabric, fluttered slightly and then rested against the window frame. Inside was a single photograph, black and white, edges worn. It showed a room he did not recognize, a desk in the corner, a clock stopped at 2:13. Harper's thumb traced the edge of the photo, and he felt the texture of pencil markings, faint lines drawn over objects in the frame, as if someone had circled or highlighted specific things long ago. The balcony door rattled slightly in the breeze, drawing his attention. Outside, the city was quieter now, the drizzle thickening, softening the neon reflections across the wet pavement. Harper stepped out onto the balcony, flashlight in hand. He noticed a ladder leaning against the side of the building below, barely visible through the mist. Footprints in the rain pooled on the concrete below suggested recent movement. Harper squinted, tracing the marks, but they disappeared around a corner, swallowed by shadow and wet stone. Back inside, he returned to the living room. A bookshelf he had passed earlier now seemed slightly askew. One book leaned forward, the spine cracked, pages fanned. He pulled it gently. Inside, a folded piece of paper slipped out. More numbers, more letters, a faint smudge that looked like a fingerprint pressed against the crease. The ink was faint, almost erased, but still legible under the flashlight beam. Harper paused, sitting slowly on the edge of the couch, letting the quiet settle around him. The apartment smelled of faint smoke, wet wood, and ink. It was dense but calm. Every object he had touched, every small disturbance he had noted, added another layer to the puzzle. A shadow moved outside the window, a passerby on the sidewalk, a distant figure hurrying through the rain, but when he looked again, it was gone, leaving only the subtle sound of water dripping from the balcony ledge. He stood, moving toward the kitchen once more, flashlight cutting across the countertops. A drawer beneath the sink was slightly ajar. Inside, a small box rattled when he nudged it. He opened it carefully. Inside were more pills, arranged in neat compartments. Some seemed untouched, others slightly shifted, and one compartment was empty. The faintest trace of powder clung to the edges, just enough to catch the light. Harper stepped back and surveyed the apartment once more. Every corner, every surface, held a hint, a subtle trace, a silent question. The night pressed against the walls, quiet but expectant, and he knew there were more whispers waiting, more movements to notice, more details to uncover. If only he followed them, slowly, deliberately, through the muted city night. Harper moved toward the bedroom once more, drawn by a faint shift in the air, a subtle disturbance that made the hairs on the back of his neck prick. The floor near the dresser was slightly scuffed, a faint line of dust brushed aside as if by a hurried step. He knelt, running a gloved finger along the mark, noting how it curved toward the closet. Inside, the coat he had examined earlier now seemed heavier, the fabric sagging unnaturally at one side. He tugged gently and discovered a small envelope tucked into the lining, nearly invisible unless the light hit it just right. Inside, a folded slip of paper bore a short string of letters, HER followed by a dash and a date, written in a hand that trembled slightly at the edges. From the bedroom window, the city below glimmered wet and diffuse under the streetlights. Harper leaned out, listening to the soft hiss of rain against the balcony rail. A faint neon sign across the street flickered, momentarily casting red and green reflections across the room. Somewhere below, a trash bag rustled, moved by wind or an unseen hand. He noted the angle, the distance, and the slight irregularity in the movement, storing it with the other minor anomalies in his mind. He returned to the kitchen. The faint metallic residue he had noticed in the mug earlier caught his attention again. He lifted the mug under the lamp, inspecting the bottom. Tiny scratches etched the interior, almost imperceptible, as though something had been stirred or scraped repeatedly. Harper ran his fingertip over the marks and realized the pattern wasn't random. One small line crossed another at a sharp angle, forming a subtle X near the center. The living room called next. Harper moved slowly across the carpet, noticing how the fibers bent differently near the sofa legs, as though someone had shifted weight there recently. He crouched, brushing his flashlight across the floor, and saw tiny flecks of something dark embedded in the threads. He collected a few in a small evidence bag. Almost nothing, but enough to preserve a trace of presence, a hint that someone had lingered, perhaps unknowingly. The study beckoned again. The laptop remained dark, yet the keyboard bore faint traces of a fingerprint. Harper compared the smudges to those on the magazine and the folded papers, noting differences in pressure and curve. The desk drawer was slightly misaligned. He opened it carefully. Inside, a stack of envelopes, all unmarked but carefully stacked in order of size. One at the bottom was oddly heavy. When he lifted it, he felt the faint resistance of a thick paper or card inside. Opening it slowly, he found a ticket stub, partially torn, for a local theater, dated 3 days prior. The edges were wet, suggesting it had been carried in a pocket on the rainy night. From the balcony again, Harper glimpsed the fire escape of the neighboring building. The metal rungs were slick with rain, reflecting the dim streetlights. Footprints, faint but visible in the moisture, climbed the first few steps, then vanished, as if someone had paused at a landing and disappeared into the darkness. He made a mental note to revisit the building from that angle, considering the path someone might have taken. In the hallway, a picture frame hung slightly crooked, a subtle tilt he had not noticed before. He straightened it and discovered a pinhole at the top corner of the frame's backing. Curious, he pulled it free and found a small key taped to the rear, its brass dull but the teeth sharp. Harper pocketed it, wondering what lock it might open, if anything. The bathroom, quiet and almost serene, called to him again. He examined the faucet, noting the tiny droplets of water that had collected around the base. There was a faint streak across the mirror that hadn't been there before, barely visible in the lamplight. He traced it with his fingertip. It felt oily, like a fingerprint pressed across the glass, and it led almost imperceptibly to the corner where the medicine cabinet met the wall. Opening the cabinet, he found small jars, labels faded. One container was slightly lighter than it should have been, as though some of its contents had been removed and replaced with powder. Harper moved back to the living room and paused near the couch. He noticed a faint impression on the fabric where the armrest met the seat cushion, a subtle curve that suggested something small had been pressed into it recently. He reached into the indentation and pulled out a thin metal strip, bent slightly, with the faint engraving of a name he couldn't immediately read. He set it aside carefully. Every movement in the apartment revealed another layer, another quiet trace of presence. A slightly open vent in the kitchen, a scuff on the hallway baseboard, a faint shadow that shifted in the lamplight. The night pressed on around him, silent except for the whisper of rain, the hum of electricity, and Harper's own measured breathing. Each detail seemed insignificant alone, yet together they wove a web, subtle and tangled, full of questions yet to be answered. He lingered in the hallway once more, flashlight resting on the floorboards, eyes scanning for the smallest disturbance. Somewhere in the apartment, a faint creak echoed, a floorboard settling, or someone else moving unseen. Harper let it hang, silent, pressing each observation into memory, knowing the investigation was far from over, each quiet clue a step deeper into the mystery. Harper's attention drifted to the small storage nook near the entryway, a space he hadn't fully examined before. The door was slightly warped at the bottom, as though it had been forced open once and then allowed to settle unevenly. Inside, the air was cooler, damp, and faintly metallic. A row of cardboard boxes, labeled in neat block letters, leaned against the wall. One box sagged at the middle, bulging slightly. He knelt to inspect it, carefully prying it open. Inside were old photographs, mostly of landscapes and cityscapes, but one photograph was different. Half a face, eyes obscured by shadow, pressed tightly to a page from a calendar. He set the box aside gently and noticed the floor beneath was dustier here than the rest of the apartment, except for a narrow path where the dust had been brushed clean. The line led toward a small cupboard tucked into the corner. Harper opened it slowly, revealing a collection of jars filled with powders of varying colors, each sealed with wax. He tilted one under the lamp. A faint metallic shimmer caught the light. The corks were scratched, some of them slightly loose, as though they had been opened recently and replaced. The bedroom called again, quiet but insistent. Harper noticed the closet door, which had been slightly ajar earlier, now closed. He nudged it gently, and it swung open with a soft squeak. Inside, a series of shoes were lined up with unusual precision, heels aligned, laces tucked carefully. One pair of boots was damp at the soles, the imprint of rainwater still visible, and a faint smell of earth clung to the leather. Above the shoes, a shelf held small boxes, each marked with initials. One box had a corner torn, exposing a bundle of folded receipts inside. He reached in and extracted one, noting the ink was faded but legible. A payment made at a small antique shop across town, timestamped just after midnight. From the balcony, the city seemed to breathe in the rain. Neon reflections blurred across wet pavement. Harper's eyes followed a faint movement across the street. A figure, hunched beneath a hood, paused at the corner, then slipped into an alley. He made a mental note, but did not move. There was no urgency in his step, only careful observation. Back in the living room, Harper knelt to examine the floor near the couch. There were faint indentations, almost invisible, like the pressure of fingertips or small objects pressing the fibers. Among them, he found a tiny screw, coated with a thin layer of rust. It fit perfectly into the edge of the metal strip he had discovered earlier near the couch. Another small, deliberate connection. In the kitchen, Harper opened the freezer slowly. Frost coated the edges, but one corner of the shelf was clear, the ice melted slightly. A faint imprint of a hand lingered in the frost. He touched it lightly, noting the warmth of someone's touch, perhaps hours old, perhaps just a trace left behind. Nearby, a small cutting board had scratches forming a subtle pattern, as if someone had used a knife with meticulous care, the movements too small to be accidental. He returned to the study. The laptop remained dark, yet the keyboard now felt warmer to the touch, as though someone had typed and left recently. Harper traced the smudges along the keys, comparing them to the fingerprints on the papers and photographs. The arcs, the pressure, the spacing, Differences and similarities combined in a pattern he could not yet decipher. The hallway clock ticked quietly, its hands moving steadily. Harper noticed the baseboards along the hallway were slightly scuffed at intervals, almost like someone had dragged objects along the walls, brushing them against the paint. One mark near the utility closet stood out, a thin streak of red-brown, partially dried, catching the light faintly. He photographed it carefully, preserving its subtlety. Near the bathroom, Harper noticed the vent grate was slightly ajar. He pressed his flashlight through the slats and saw the interior coated with dust, but one corner appeared recently disturbed. A tiny piece of paper wedged inside the vent caught his attention. He retrieved it with tweezers, a fragment of a map, folded and torn, edges frayed, showing a series of alleyways and numbered buildings, barely legible in the dim light. He paused in the living room, letting the apartment settle around him. The rain outside fell steadily, the neon reflections on wet asphalt shimmering faintly through the windows. Every object, every surface seemed alive with quiet history, small traces of presence and movement. The apartment held its secrets tightly, revealing them only through Harper's deliberate, unhurried attention, layer by layer, hint by subtle hint. From the balcony, he watched the street again. Footsteps echoed softly in the distance, measured, deliberate, fading into the night. Harper knew the apartment had more to show, more whispers to reveal, and he felt the weight of every quiet, understated clue pressing against the stillness, urging him to continue, slowly, methodically, deeper into the mystery. Harper moved to the narrow corridor that led to the second bedroom, the floorboards creaking softly under his weight. The door was slightly warped at the bottom, and as he nudged it open, a faint smell of must and ink drifted out. The room was sparsely furnished, a small desk against the far wall, a metal chair pushed neatly beneath it, and a low bookshelf crowded with paperbacks whose spines were sun-bleached and worn. A single lamp cast a pale circle of light on the desk, leaving the corners of the room in shadow. On the desk, a journal lay open, its pages filled with neat, looping handwriting. Harper leaned closer, careful not to disturb the book, and traced the entries. Many were mundane, lists, small notes about errands and meals, but tucked between them were subtle references to times and locations. Midnight, corner of 5th and Maple, 2:15 a.m., lights on in apartment 3B, door ajar, no one inside. He paused at the last entry, noting the specificity, the almost obsessive care with details. A soft tap came from the window. Harper turned, flashlight cutting across the pane. Raindrops clung to the glass, forming streaks as they slid downward. Outside, the balcony railing was slick, and he noticed a thin thread of rope caught on one of the bars, frayed and wet. He leaned out cautiously, examining the rope. Its texture suggested it had been tied quickly, yet deliberately, and it was the right thickness to support weight, small but unmistakable. Back inside, the bookshelf drew his attention. One volume was oddly heavier than the others. He pulled it free and found a small compartment carved into its pages. Inside lay a folded map of the neighborhood, lines and circles drawn in pencil, marking alleys, building numbers, and faint arrows that seemed to trace routes through the streets. Some areas were shaded lightly, almost imperceptibly. Harper traced them with his finger, noting the repetition of certain corners, the same locations that had appeared in the journal. The floor beneath the bed was dusty, and as he knelt to examine it, Harper noticed a thin smear along the edge of the carpet, too fine to be dirt. He ran a gloved finger along the mark, It had a subtle stickiness, like dried syrup or something organic, faintly aromatic. Nearby, a single sock lay scrunched, not paired with its mate, and Harper straightened it. Inside, he discovered a tiny slip of paper folded into a narrow rectangle, bearing the letters VC and a time, 2:13. He stood, moving toward the closet. The door creaked slightly as he opened it. Inside, jackets hung neatly, but at the bottom, a cardboard box had shifted from its original position. He lifted the lid carefully. Inside were envelopes, each containing a photograph. The images were all interiors, rooms with furniture arranged in precise ways. Some rooms looked familiar, the open drawers, the tilted frames, but others were completely unknown. In one, a clock stopped at 2:13, mirroring the time in the journal and the note in the sock. Harper's eyes drifted to the corner near the window. A small radiator hummed softly, warmth radiating faintly against the chill in the room. He crouched and noticed a faint wet ring on the floor beneath it, irregular in shape. He tapped it with his fingertip. The residue was powdery, lightly sticking to his glove. Its color was pale, almost white. Harper made a mental note, tucking the glove carefully to avoid contamination. He walked to the doorway and glanced into the hallway. The apartment was quiet except for the soft patter of rain against the windows and the low hum of the radiator. A faint smell of smoke lingered, but Harper still could not locate its source. The floorboards groaned subtly as he retraced his steps toward the living room, noting again how the rug near the couch had slight indentations, now appearing more deliberate, like they had been pressed by something heavy and removed. Near the kitchen, the faucet had droplets clinging to it in irregular patterns. Harper ran his fingertip along the base, noticing tiny scratches along the edge. Something had been twisted or forced here repeatedly. Beside the sink, the cutting board's faint scratches now seemed intentional, forming lines that might have been overlooked before, almost like symbols, tiny, almost invisible. He paused in the center of the apartment, flashlight in hand, breathing softly, letting the quiet settle. Each room, each subtle disturbance, each trace left behind told a fragment of the story. Nothing yet resolved, but the rhythm of presence, of movement, of observation, pulsed quietly through the apartment. Harper felt it, layer upon layer, in the scuff of floorboards, the tilt of picture frames, the whisper of rain against the windows, the faint traces left behind like breadcrumbs in a house that had yet to give up its secrets. From the balcony, he glanced again at the neighboring fire escape. The wet metal reflected the neon of a distant sign, and faint footprints glimmered where water pooled in depressions on the steps. They ended abruptly at the landing, swallowed by shadow. Harper exhaled slowly, sensing the invisible threads connecting the apartment to the streets outside, the patterns he could only begin to trace. Each quiet clue, each subtle hint, waited patiently, just beyond reach, pressing him to continue, carefully, deliberately, further into the unfolding mystery. Harper stepped into the narrow service corridor behind the kitchen, a space he had barely noticed before. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed faintly, casting pale rectangles onto the walls, and the air smelled faintly of damp concrete and cleaning solution. A mop bucket sat in the corner, pushed back as though someone had used it in a hurry and then abandoned it. Harper knelt to inspect the floor. Tiny streaks of mud, only visible where the light caught them, led toward a metal door at the far end. He pressed his ear to the door and heard nothing, but the surface was cold under his palm, worn where fingers might have brushed repeatedly. Sliding it open carefully, he entered a small utility room. Exposed pipes ran along the ceiling, valves glinting in the dim light. A shelf against the wall held jars of screws, nails, and other hardware, each labeled in faint, handwritten script. One jar, however, had no label and was tipped slightly. Harper lifted it and found a folded note tucked beneath. The paper was thin and brittle, smudged with a dark substance, and bore a single word: wait. He pocketed the note and noticed the floor here was uneven, the concrete cracked in subtle patterns. A small puddle had formed near a pipe, and within it floated a fragment of something pale, almost translucent. Harper bent and realized it was a thin piece of plastic, curved, like a fragment of a container lid. Its surface was scuffed, scratched. Returning to the main apartment, Harper found himself drawn to the hallway near the bathroom. The baseboard along the wall bore a faint scratch pattern, almost imperceptible unless caught in the corner of the flashlight beam. He traced it slowly, noticing how it curved near the corner of the door frame. Dust clung lightly to the edges, except where the scratch had disturbed it, revealing a cleaner line of the original wood. In the second bedroom, the journal still lay open. Harper returned to it, rereading entries he had skimmed earlier. One passage caught his eye. Footsteps in the hall at 2:13. No one answers. Lights moved, objects displaced. Patterns repeat. He frowned, noticing the repetition of the time, the attention to minor disturbances. The writing was meticulous but carried a tension, a quiet urgency hidden beneath the neat script. The living room rug drew him again. Harper knelt, brushing the fibers carefully with his gloved fingers. Beneath the couch, he discovered a faint smear, darker than the dust, sticky in a way that suggested residue from something organic. He lifted the couch slightly and found a small, crumpled envelope wedged underneath. Inside were tiny fragments of paper, torn from receipts or notes, all stamped with dates and times, some overlapping in a way that suggested someone had been cataloging movements, almost obsessively. A faint hum drew him to the kitchen. The refrigerator was closed, humming steadily, but Harper noticed condensation along the door seal that formed tiny droplets, irregular in shape. He wiped one with a fingertip and found a faint streak of rust-colored residue along the rubber lining. It was subtle, almost mist, yet deliberate, a trace left by contact, perhaps by a hand. From the balcony, he observed the city streets once more. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and faint light from the lampposts created long reflections across the wet pavement. Across the street, a small alleyway appeared darker than the rest. The shadows deepened near stacked crates and trash bins. Harper noted the placement of the crates, slight gaps between them, as if someone had slipped through in the dark. He traced the possible path in his mind, imagining footsteps careful, deliberate, calculated. Back in the hallway, Harper noticed a slight warping of the wallpaper near the ceiling. He touched it gently, and a small flap lifted. Behind it, a thin wire ran along the wall, its end disappearing behind the base of the bedroom door. He followed it slowly, careful not to disturb the connection. The wire was taut, and its presence suggested something electrical, or perhaps surveillance. Its subtlety intentional, meant to go unnoticed. The apartment felt alive in these quiet ways, with movement hinted at rather than seen, with traces of presence scattered and layered like whispers in the night. Harper paused, flashlight in hand, listening to the soft patter of residual rain, the hum of pipes, the occasional distant footfall outside. Each anomaly, each subtle clue, pressed against the stillness, inviting careful observation. He moved forward, deliberately, sensing that each new discovery would thread into a larger, hidden pattern, one that had yet to reveal itself, waiting patiently, quietly, in the shadows. Harper stepped carefully into the small alcove beside the entryway, a space that had remained largely in shadow until now. The walls were painted a pale, washed-out gray, and the corners were thick with dust that had settled over weeks, perhaps months. Near the floor, a faint scuff led toward the bottom shelf of a built-in cabinet. He knelt, brushing the dust aside with a gloved hand, revealing a tiny fragment of paper pressed against the wood. The edge was folded, worn, with barely legible pencil marks, a series of numbers in tight, uneven handwriting. He opened the cabinet slowly. Inside, cleaning supplies lined the shelves neatly, but one container was out of place. A small tin, unlabeled, its lid slightly dented. Harper lifted it and found a folded receipt, old and frayed at the edges, the ink faded but still readable. A transaction at a dry cleaner 3 nights prior. A faint spot of red marred the corner of the paper, almost invisible unless he caught it under the flashlight beam. The bedroom called him again. Harper moved across the apartment in silence, noticing the way the carpet muffled his footsteps, the faint echo of water dripping somewhere in the bathroom. The bedspread had shifted slightly since he last looked. He knelt and found a hairpin tucked into the seam, its metal worn and scratched. He picked it up and rotated it, catching the faint reflection of light across its surface, noting a tiny smudge of an unknown substance at the bend. At the desk in the second bedroom, the journal remained open. Harper traced the entries again, his eyes drawn to repeated references to times and locations, the careful observation of objects being moved. One passage mentioned a small cafe near the edge of the city, a back room where the lights flickered and the stools left impressions in the floor. Harper made a mental note, imagining the scene, a dimly lit space, quiet except for faint music, chairs scraping lightly against the wood, someone watching from the shadows. He moved toward the bathroom, noting the mirror again. The streaks he had observed earlier now seemed more pronounced. He traced them gently and discovered a tiny engraving along the edge of the glass, a symbol almost imperceptible, etched delicately, deliberate. Below it, the soap dish had a faint smear of residue, darker than the pale soap bar, with the slightest trace of granular particles embedded in the streak. In the kitchen, Harper opened a drawer that had seemed ordinary before. Inside, a collection of utensils lay arranged with unusual precision. One knife bore tiny scratches along the blade's edge, forming a subtle pattern, almost like a cipher. He picked it up carefully, noting the way the light caught the scratches and the faint residue along the handle. Beside the knife, a folded napkin contained a few crumbs, darkened and hardened, as if pressed there intentionally. From the balcony, Harper looked down at the street. Puddles reflected neon signs and street lights, distorted into long, vertical streaks. A bicycle leaned against a lamppost, its tires wet, faint footprints surrounding it in irregular angles, suggesting someone had stopped, adjusted something, then left. Across the street, an alleyway appeared darker, the shadows pooling beneath dumpsters and stacked crates. Harper traced a potential path along the wet asphalt, imagining careful, deliberate steps. Back inside, he noticed a vent near the living room corner. The slats had been shifted slightly, one bent upward. He pressed his flashlight inside, illuminating dust and a thin wire coiled carefully within. The wire ran along the wall, disappearing behind the base of the sofa. Harper followed its line, noting the meticulous placement, the subtle way it had been hidden in plain sight. He paused in the hallway, flashlight sweeping the apartment. Every object seemed to hold a secret. A book slightly heavier than its neighbors, a mug with a faint residue, a floorboard scarred by pressure, a folded piece of paper tucked under a cushion. The apartment breathed in quiet tension, each minor disturbance a whisper of something larger, something methodical. Harper's gloved hands hovered over the surfaces, careful, deliberate, absorbing the environment. From the balcony, he glimpsed the neighboring rooftop, slick with rain. Footprints crossed the tiles, some faint, some more pronounced, leading toward a hatch that disappeared into shadow. He noted the sequence, the spacing, the subtle variation in depth. Someone had been here, moving carefully, leaving traces meant to be noticed only by those paying attention. Harper exhaled slowly, sensing the invisible threads connecting the apartment to the streets, the alleys, the rooftops, a web of quiet, deliberate movements waiting to be unraveled. Every step, every observation, every subtle clue drew him deeper into the apartment's layered mysteries, each discovery pressing forward the sense that the story was not yet ready to reveal itself, but was watching, waiting, patient and deliberate, as Harper continued through the quiet, rain-muted night. Harper moved toward the small hallway closet again, the one he had only glanced at before. Its door, painted a pale beige, had a tiny chip at the corner where the wood had splintered. He nudged it open and was met with the faint scent of cedar and damp fabric. Jackets hung neatly, but near the floor a cardboard box protruded slightly from its shelf. He lifted it carefully, discovering a jumble of old letters tied with a faded ribbon. The edges of the envelopes were brittle, some water-stained, and the ink on the addresses had begun to blur. One envelope, heavier than the rest, contained a folded piece of parchment with a faint grid of lines drawn in pencil, intersecting at irregular angles. He set the box aside and noticed the closet floor. Dust had settled unevenly, revealing a narrow trail of footprints, small and careful, leading back toward the bedroom. Harper knelt, brushing away more dust, revealing a few flecks of something darker, almost like soot or ash, clinging to the fibers. The trail ended at the base of the wall, where a faint outline suggested a piece of furniture had been moved recently. The second bedroom caught his attention again. He approached the desk and ran a gloved hand over the surface, noting the faint warmth of a recently used laptop charger plugged into the wall. Papers were stacked with obsessive precision, some slightly damp from the lingering humidity. He opened a drawer and found a small wooden box carved with delicate patterns. Inside were several folded slips of paper, each with a single word or number written in tight, careful script. Harper picked up one that read, "Vault," and another, 7:42 p.m. The paper felt fragile in his hands, almost as if it had been kept aside intentionally, waiting to be found. From the bedroom window, he looked down at the street below. Rain had eased to a drizzle, and puddles mirrored the neon lights, distorted into soft, elongated shapes. Across the alley, a dumpster lid was slightly ajar, and the faint glint of metal peeked from inside. Footsteps had pressed the mud unevenly along the edge of the sidewalk, suggesting someone had paused, adjusted, and continued. Harper traced the marks with his eyes, noting the spacing and the direction, imagining the careful, deliberate motion of the person who had left them. Returning to the kitchen, Harper opened the top drawer again. The utensils were aligned neatly, but he noticed one pair of scissors with a faint reddish-brown smear along the tip. He touched it with a gloved fingertip, dried, faint, but unmistakable. The cutting board nearby bore scratches forming small, almost imperceptible symbols, curving along the grain of the wood. Harper tilted the board under the lamp, catching the subtle shadows of the marks. They seemed deliberate, repetitive, like someone had used it as a makeshift notepad for patterns. In the living room, he focused on the rug beneath the couch. The indentations there now appeared more deliberate, arranged in a way that suggested small objects had been moved or lifted in sequence. Harper leaned closer, brushing aside a few fibers and discovering a tiny metallic fragment, twisted slightly and etched with a faint engraving. A single letter, nearly worn away. He pocketed it, careful not to disturb its shape. The hallway clock ticked quietly, its soft rhythm pressing against the apartment's stillness. Harper noticed the wallpaper along the corridor, peeling slightly near the ceiling. He reached up and lifted a small flap, revealing a thin wire running horizontally behind it, disappearing into the wall near the second bedroom. He followed the wire carefully, noting how it was fastened in subtle loops to remain hidden, and realized it connected several points in the apartment in a pattern he could not yet decipher. The balcony beckoned again. Harper stepped out, flashlight sweeping the neighboring rooftops. The fire escape had faint footprints, damp from the drizzle, leading to a small hatch at the far end. The metal was slick and worn, suggesting repeated use. He traced the path with his eyes, imagining someone moving cautiously across the roof, slipping through shadows, leaving faint traces for no one to see. He returned to the bathroom, drawn by the faint streak on the mirror. Harper traced it slowly, noticing a tiny etching along the edge, a symbol almost invisible, delicate, and deliberate. Below, the soap dish bore a faint smear, with granular residue embedded in the streak. The faucet had tiny scratches forming a subtle pattern, curved lines almost imperceptible. Each small mark, each residue, seemed to echo the meticulous presence he had sensed throughout the apartment. Harper paused in the center of the living room, letting the apartment's quiet settle around him. Every corner, every surface, every shadow held something. A folded paper, a faint smear, a displaced object, an imprint in dust. The apartment breathed in these subtle movements, each trace part of a pattern that remained just out of reach. Outside, the rain murmured softly against the windows, the city distant yet alive. Harper exhaled slowly, knowing each discovery pressed him deeper into a careful, deliberate observation, the mystery stretching quietly before him, patient, layered, and unresolved. Harper moved quietly toward the building's basement door, a place he had avoided before. The air grew cooler as he descended the narrow staircase, each step creaking underfoot. The walls were painted cinder-block gray, damp in places, with the faint scent of mildew and rust lingering. At the bottom, the fluorescent light flickered intermittently, casting long, wavering shadows across rows of lockers and storage cubbies. He paused near one of the lockers, noticing that its lock had been recently disturbed. A faint smudge of what looked like soil clung to the latch, as if someone had touched it with gloved hands after handling dirt. Harper knelt and traced the edge of the metal, discovering a tiny notch carved into the surface, deliberate, precise, almost a code in miniature. He pressed the flashlight further along the row and noticed one locker door hung slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible inside. Inside the locker was a jumble of items, a rolled-up rug, a cardboard box, and a small duffel bag, its zipper partially open. Harper moved the rug aside and found a set of keys, one brass, one silver, both worn with frequent use. Tucked beneath them, A folded note lay flat, the edges darkened from moisture. The handwriting was small, neat, and cramped, the words sparse. Third floor, midnight, door unlocked. He pocketed the note carefully and examined the duffel bag. Its contents were scattered papers, some blank, some with faint pencil sketches of rooms and furniture. One sketch showed a living room remarkably similar to the apartment he had been investigating, down to the slant of the floorboards and the tilt of a picture frame. Harper ran a fingertip across the pencil lines, noticing the precision, the repeated attention to detail. The basement floor was littered with small debris, fragments of cardboard, a few screws, and a strip of tape partially stuck to the concrete. Harper traced the tape with his gloved hand, discovering it led toward a narrow alcove behind the utility pipes. There, a small stack of magazines lay in disarray, each marked on the corner with a tiny pencil dot. He leafed through one carefully, an article about a local cafe, the edges damp and curling, a faint smudge along the margin. A faint humming drew his attention to the far corner of the basement, where a wall-mounted electrical box hung slightly open. Harper approached, noting the wires inside, some frayed, some neatly coiled, and a small, dark stain on the metal surface. He pressed gently with his gloved finger. The surface was sticky, as if some liquid had dried there, leaving a residue with a subtle, metallic scent. Harper's eyes were drawn to a service door at the end of the corridor, slightly misaligned with the frame. The hinges creaked softly as he nudged it open. Beyond was a narrow maintenance passage, the air colder still, carrying the faint echo of dripping water. Footprints marred the concrete floor, shallow but distinct, leading toward another stairwell that climbed back up to the third floor. Harper followed the line with his flashlight, noting the irregular spacing, suggesting someone had moved deliberately, cautiously, pausing at intervals. On the third floor landing, Harper noticed the faint smell of smoke, almost imperceptible, and the subtle warmth near a radiator. A door across the hallway bore scuff marks near the bottom, paired with a small indentation in the frame, like something heavy had been pressed against it. He knelt and traced the marks with his gloved hand, feeling the slight give of the wood, noticing dust disturbed along the edges. From the landing, Harper glanced down the hallway. The lighting was dim, flickering faintly, casting muted shadows across the walls. A small vent near the ceiling appeared slightly ajar, its slats shifted. He climbed carefully onto the radiator, reaching toward it. Inside, he found a tiny envelope wedged in the ductwork. The paper was thin, brittle at the corners, and bore a single, faintly drawn symbol resembling a triangle with a line beneath it. He pocketed the envelope and stepped back onto the landing, listening. The building was silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant drip of water from the basement. Outside, the faint patter of rain continued against the windows. Each observation pressed Harper deeper into the investigation. Footprints, scratches, folded notes, symbols, all small, deliberate traces of presence. He paused near the stairwell, flashlight scanning the hallway. The faint impression of someone moving carefully through these spaces lingered in the dust and scuff marks, in the irregular placement of objects, in the subtle residue left behind. Harper exhaled slowly, sensing the intricate web of small, deliberate actions woven through the building, each one a whisper leading him further into the quiet, patient mystery that had yet to reveal itself. Harper continued down the third-floor corridor, moving with deliberate quiet. The carpet, thin and worn, muffled his steps, though he noticed the faint impressions where shoes had pressed deeper into the fibers, suggesting someone had walked the same path repeatedly. A flickering light above the fire exit cast a pale glow onto the walls, revealing streaks where water had dripped in long, slow lines, each one darkened at the edges from time and dampness. Near a stairwell landing, he noticed a narrow door set flush with the wall. The paint was chipped at the bottom, and the doorknob bore faint scratches. Harper turned it slowly, discovering a small storage closet beyond, cramped and dimly lit. Inside were stacks of cardboard boxes labeled with months and years. Most were dusty and closed, but one had been disturbed recently. Harper knelt, brushing the dust aside. Inside were rolls of paper, tied with string, with diagrams and sketches similar to those he had seen in the basement. One sketch showed the interior of a room he recognized, mirrors positioned to reflect hallways, small objects deliberately shifted, lines and angles suggesting observation, calculation. He examined the floor beneath the closet shelves. Dust covered most of the space, but faint smudges caught the beam of his flashlight. Small footprints, perhaps from a woman's shoe, led to a corner where a metal panel in the wall was slightly misaligned. Harper pressed it gently and heard the faintest click. The panel shifted inward, revealing a narrow cavity. Inside lay a small, folded piece of paper and a brass key, warm to the touch as though recently handled. He pocketed both, careful not to disturb the delicate alignment. Returning to the corridor, Harper noticed a vent near the ceiling with slats slightly bent outward. He climbed carefully onto the radiator beneath it. Peering inside, he discovered a strip of tape folded over a small bundle of wires. The tape had a handwritten label, almost illegible. Check 215. Harper made a mental note, the time echoing the recurring pattern he had seen in the apartment and the basement. A few doors down, the hallway opened into a small lounge area. The room smelled faintly of coffee and damp upholstery. A low bookshelf against the wall held magazines, each marked with small pencil dots in the corners. Harper flipped through one and found notes scribbled in the margins, addresses, times, and initials he didn't recognize. Near the window, a chair had been pushed slightly askew, revealing scuffs on the floor where it had been moved. He traced the scuffs with his gloved fingers, noticing the faint residue of something granular embedded in the scratches. The balcony at the end of the corridor beckoned again. Harper stepped out, the chill of the night air mixing with the faint drizzle. Across the rooftops, he noticed a narrow ledge along the side of the neighboring building. A faint imprint in the wet surface suggested recent passage, a scuffed shoe tread, damp and pressed, ending abruptly near a vent hatch. The impression was subtle, easy to miss, but deliberate. Harper traced its direction with his eyes, imagining careful, measured movement, someone aware of observation, yet moving confidently through shadowed spaces. Back inside, Harper focused on the lounge's small table. A coaster bore tiny scratches in the varnish, curving in a deliberate pattern, almost like shorthand. Beside it, a folded napkin contained a few crumbs, darkened, pressed flat, as though someone had stored it deliberately rather than left it behind by accident. He pocketed the napkin, noting the subtle care in its placement. He returned to the stairwell, listening. The building was quiet except for distant dripping water and the soft hum of a radiator. The faint patter of rain outside had slowed, leaving a gentle echo across the hallways. Every scuff, every residue, every folded paper or scratched surface pressed upon him like whispers. Harper exhaled slowly, sensing the intricate, patient pattern of movement through the building. Traces of presence left in careful, almost ritualized sequences. He paused on the landing, flashlight sweeping the corridor, tracing the faint lines of footprints, scuffs, and dust disturbances. The building held its secrets deliberately, offering only small, careful hints. Harper felt the quiet tension of observation, the rhythm of presence and absence, and knew the next discovery would deepen the mystery further, connecting the subtle clues in ways he could not yet fully perceive. The apartment, the basement, the corridors, all of it breathed slowly around him, patient, layered, waiting for careful attention to draw out the hidden narrative stitched through every shadowed corner. Harper descended another flight of stairs, the metal treads slick with condensation from the lingering drizzle outside. The stairwell smelled faintly of oil and damp concrete, each step echoing softly against the enclosed space. At the bottom, he entered a narrow corridor that led to what appeared to be a service entrance, its gray doors scuffed and worn. The handle bore faint scratches, as though someone had turned it frequently, hurriedly. Inside, a dimly lit storage area stretched along the wall. Shelves lined with cleaning supplies and maintenance equipment formed tight aisles, the air thick with the faint scent of bleach and dust. Harper ran a gloved finger along the edge of one shelf, noticing a thin residue, almost sticky, that caught the light. It led toward a metal cabinet tucked into a corner. He opened it slowly. Inside were small cardboard boxes, each labeled with handwritten dates and numbers. One box had been opened recently, its flaps bent outward, revealing envelopes filled with folded papers. He took one envelope, carefully unfolding the contents. A single sheet bore a sketch of a narrow hallway, not unlike the stairwell he had just descended, with tiny marks along the floor, indicating points of pause or placement. In the margin, a note, observe, record, wait. The handwriting matched other notes he had found earlier. Harper pressed the paper flat, sensing the quiet, deliberate intent behind it. A low hum drew his attention toward a corner where an old boiler hissed softly. Harper moved closer, noting a small puddle beneath it, reflecting the dim light in uneven patterns. Embedded in the puddle's edge were tiny fragments of paper, darkened at the corners. He picked one up carefully. It bore a single word, third. He tucked it into his pocket. Near the back wall, a service cart leaned against the pipes, its wheels scuffed and worn. Harper brushed aside a small pile of dust beneath it, revealing faint impressions of footprints. The size suggested someone smaller than the average adult, and the spacing was uneven, as though the person had paused frequently. One print pressed against a small metal grate, where the edge of a note peeked through. Harper pulled it free, a folded scrap, marked with the time 2:13 in careful, neat writing. He moved toward a narrow door at the end of the corridor, its hinges squeaking softly as he nudged it open. The room beyond was a janitorial closet, cramped, with shelves stacked high with bottles and cleaning rags. A faint smear of an unknown substance led from the floor to a low cabinet. Harper knelt, brushing away dust and grime, and found a small key taped underneath. The tape was old but had been placed deliberately, folded with precision. A vent near the ceiling drew his gaze next. Harper climbed onto a nearby shelf, shining his flashlight inside. A thin wire had been threaded through the ductwork, its end disappearing behind the wall near the boiler. He followed the line with his eyes, noting the careful placement and subtle routing. Every detail had been arranged with purpose, hidden in plain sight. He stepped back into the corridor, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light. The echoes of dripping water from the boiler, the faint hum of the fluorescent fixture, the soft patter of rain through a nearby grate. all layered together into a quiet rhythm. Harper traced the footprints again, observing their direction toward another door, partially obscured by shadows. Leaning close, he noticed faint scratches on the door frame, almost imperceptible, forming a subtle pattern along the edge. The scratches aligned with the marks he had found on other doors, on the apartment floorboards, in the basement. Each one was small, deliberate, almost like a breadcrumb trail meant to be noticed only by someone paying careful attention. A small window near the ceiling showed the street outside. Rain had slowed, leaving puddles reflecting neon light. Across the alley, faint shapes shifted. A crate moved slightly, perhaps by the wind or perhaps by someone unseen. Harper's flashlight traced the floor again, landing on a thin smear along the concrete, almost like dried residue from a liquid. He pressed a gloved fingertip to it, feeling the texture, faintly sticky, almost imperceptible but deliberate. Harper exhaled, sensing the layered pattern of human presence etched into every corner. Scratches, notes, footprints, smudges, and symbols repeated with quiet intent. Each detail seemed to echo the others, forming a rhythm he could follow only slowly, deliberately, carefully. The building breathed around him, patient and watchful, holding its secrets just out of reach, and he knew the next discovery would thread another delicate layer into the quiet, unfolding web of the mystery. Harper returned to the apartment, moving through the dim hallway with the flashlight tracing the edges of the walls. He paused by the front door, noticing the lock's latch had a faint scrape, shallow and precise, almost imperceptible unless caught just right. The pattern repeated the marks he had seen in the stairwell, a subtle echo of presence. He stepped into the kitchen, the faint hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. The floor was damp in a corner by the sink, tiny droplets reflecting the light. Harper knelt, brushing his fingers over them, finding a few minute impressions of what appeared to be scuffed shoe soles. He followed the marks toward the pantry door, noticing that the edge of the doorframe bore tiny scratches, delicate arcs pressed into the wood. Opening the pantry, he found stacks of canned goods and jars, everything orderly except for a small cardboard box at the bottom. Inside were several folded receipts, edges darkened and curling. One was stamped with a time. 2:14 a.m. Harper's gloved finger traced the numbers, faintly embossed, almost missed if not felt carefully. Beneath the receipts, a thin piece of wire curled back on itself, threaded through a hole in the box, disappearing into a gap behind the shelving. He left the pantry and moved into the living room. The rug near the window had shifted since his last visit, the corner turned back slightly. Beneath it, a faint smear of a powdery substance clung to the fibers. Harper brushed it gently and discovered a fragment of paper folded tiny and pressed flat. Opening it revealed a single word, observe. The balcony drew him again. Rain had slowed to a soft mist, the city lights blurred in the wet streets below. Harper noticed a discarded bottle cap near the edge of the railing, its surface scuffed, as if pressed or moved deliberately. Across the alley, a window on the neighboring building glimmered faintly. The curtain shifted slightly, though no sound came from within. Harper's flashlight traced the alley floor, small irregular prints, leading from a drain pipe to a fire escape ladder. The spacing suggested careful, deliberate steps, someone pausing, adjusting, retreating. Back inside, he paused by the second bedroom door. The journal lay on the desk, open to a page he hadn't read before. The writing was cramped, filled with numbers, arrows, and notes in the margins. Footsteps mirrored. Patterns repeat. Check 213 to 215. Harper leaned closer, noticing a small stain along the corner of the page, faint and dark, partially absorbed by the paper. He held the page to the light, seeing that the stain matched the residue he had found in the basement, the hallway, and the kitchen. He moved toward the bathroom, drawn to the faint etching in the mirror again. Tracing it slowly, he noticed additional marks he hadn't seen before. Tiny scratches forming a subtle sequence along the edge of the glass, almost like a map of motion, careful and deliberate. Below, the soap dish bore a residue, granular and darkened. Harper touched it gently, feeling the texture shift under his gloved finger. In the hallway closet, the cardboard box still rested on the floor. Harper opened it again and found another envelope, small and carefully folded. Inside was a note, "Third floor vent. Watch." He pressed the paper flat and looked toward the ceiling vent. Its slats were slightly shifted, catching the faintest trace of light. Harper climbed carefully onto the radiator beneath it, peering inside. A thin wire ran along the ductwork, disappearing back into the wall, taut and deliberate, placed with care to avoid notice. Every space he entered revealed minor disturbances. Scratches, smudges, small objects moved slightly, fragments of paper or residue hidden in corners. Each clue was deliberate, subtle, forming patterns that whispered of methodical presence. Harper exhaled slowly, sensing the patience embedded in the environment, the careful choreography of someone unseen. The apartment, the hallways, the basement, all held fragments of movement, observation, and time, layered quietly, waiting for each discovery to be pieced together. He paused in the living room, flashlights sweeping the apartment. The rain murmured against the windows, faint echoes from distant streets whispered through cracks, and every small clue pressed quietly against the silence. Harper traced the scratches, the smudges, the fragments, knowing the hidden narrative had yet to reveal itself fully, its pattern deliberate, patient, and watchful. Harper lingered in the living room, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light. The apartment seemed to settle around him, every object holding a quiet tension. He moved toward the hallway that led to the third bedroom he had yet to explore fully. The door creaked softly as he pushed it open, revealing a small, boxy room with a single window overlooking the alley. The floor was scattered with scraps of paper, notes, receipts, and tiny sketches. Harper knelt and examined one. It bore a series of small rectangles and lines, almost like a floor plan, but with the irregular markings he had seen elsewhere. Tiny arrows, subtle dots, numbers in the margins. He held it up to the light and noticed faint smudges along the edges, fingerprints pressed with care. A dresser against the wall had drawers slightly misaligned, one pulled out just enough to reveal its contents. Inside, a set of photographs lay tucked beneath a thin layer of dust. The images were dark, grainy, but recognizable. Hallways, doorways, street corners, some clearly from the building itself, others showing the nearby block. One photograph captured the fire escape he had observed from the balcony, the metal rungs slick with rain. A faint smudge across the photo suggested it had been handled recently. Harper moved to the window. The alley below was quiet, slick with residual rain, the faint neon glow from a nearby sign casting reflections onto the wet pavement. A crate had shifted slightly, as if recently nudged, leaving faint streaks in the puddles. Footprints led away, pressed shallowly into the wet concrete, then disappeared into the shadow of the fire escape. On the bedroom floor, a small metal box caught his eye. It was unmarked, the surface scratched lightly along the edges. Inside were 3 folded slips of paper. One listed a time, 2:16 a.m. Another had a single word, observe. The third contained a string of letters and numbers, precise and deliberate, almost like a code. Harper traced each with his gloved fingers, noting how the marks pressed into the paper, deliberate and exact. He turned toward a closet in the corner. The door was slightly ajar, revealing shelves lined with old containers and boxes. A small cardboard box had been moved recently. Dust pushed aside in a narrow arc. Harper lifted it carefully and found a thin, coiled wire tucked beneath. It ran through a gap in the wall, disappearing silently. He followed the line with his eyes, imagining its path behind the drywall, connecting points he could not yet see. Near the door, a small rug had been shifted. Harper lifted it and found faint scratches along the floorboards beneath, subtle arcs, almost like a sequence. Beside them lay a tiny fragment of paper pressed flat, bearing a symbol, a triangle with a single horizontal line beneath it. He recognized the mark from the vent in the corridor, etched carefully, repeated. Harper exhaled slowly, letting the quiet of the room press around him. Every scrap of paper, every scuff, every trace of residue or subtle mark seemed deliberate, a small part of a larger rhythm he could sense but not yet decode. The apartment held its secrets patient and watchful, layering the traces of unseen movements, careful observation, and intentional delay. He moved back toward the hallway, flashlights sweeping over the walls. A faint streak of discoloration ran along the baseboard, subtle and easy to miss, almost like residue from a liquid, dried unevenly. Harper pressed gently, noting the texture, sticky and faint, evidence of recent presence. The air was cool, still, carrying the faintest hum from the radiator. Each sound, each faint echo, seemed magnified in the silence. Pausing on the landing, Harper glanced down the hall toward the door to the living room. Every step he had taken, every object he had touched, felt connected to a quiet, patient choreography. Footprints, smudges, scratches, folded papers, photographs, wires, symbols, all tiny, deliberate traces layered across rooms, floors, corridors, stairwells, and the alley outside. The rain outside had eased further, leaving puddles and damp reflections across the street. Harper traced the subtle patterns in his mind, sensing the methodical nature of the movements, the care with which each trace had been left. The building seemed to breathe softly, patient and silent, waiting for him to follow its quiet, intricate clues deeper into the deliberate rhythm of presence and absence. Harper stepped carefully down the narrow stairwell that connected the third floor to the roof access hatch. The metal steps were damp from the lingering rain, slick under his boots, and each echo of his weight seemed louder in the confined space. A faint smell of rust lingered, mixed with the sharp tang of wet concrete. At the top, the hatch groaned softly as he pushed it open, revealing a narrow ledge along the building's edge. The city stretched out below, slick streets reflecting scattered streetlights. Rain had stopped, leaving a mist that hung low, blurring the lines of buildings and alleyways. Harper's flashlight traced the edge of the roof, revealing a thin line of footprints in accumulated dust, leading toward the corner where a ventilation shaft opened. The marks were shallow but deliberate, pressed lightly as if whoever had walked there had moved cautiously, aware of every sound. He knelt to examine them, noticing a small metallic fragment embedded in the dust, barely visible. It looked like a piece of wire insulation, cut cleanly at one end. Harper pocketed it, Noting the pattern, the footprints seemed to pause just beyond the vent, then continued toward the adjoining rooftop, tapering off where the slabs met the parapet. He followed the parapet's edge toward a service ladder descending to a lower section of the building. The ladder was slick, the metal cold under his gloves. Halfway down, Harper noticed a small bundle of twine tied around one of the rungs, frayed at the ends but intentionally placed. It suggested someone had used the ladder recently, anchoring or marking their path. At the lower level, he entered a narrow service corridor leading back into the building. The air was cooler here, carrying the faint scent of damp masonry and an old electrical conduit that hummed softly. Along the wall, Harper saw faint smudges, streaks pressed into the dust, fingerprints that had brushed against the brick, darkened and slightly oily. They trailed toward a small door, slightly ajar, revealing a maintenance closet lined with shelves. Inside, a stack of cardboard boxes had been shifted, leaving the floor beneath partially exposed. Harper noticed a small pile of envelopes tucked under the lowest shelf, their edges worn. He lifted one carefully. A sketch of the apartment's kitchen, the symbols, scratches, and faint marks he had seen elsewhere mapped out precisely, almost obsessively. Notes in the margins referenced times: 2:13, 2:15, 2:16. The repetition made him pause. Each minute seemed deliberately documented. A faint draft drew his attention to a vent near the ceiling. Harper climbed a shelf to peer inside. A thin wire ran along the interior ductwork, disappearing behind the far wall. He followed it visually as far as he could, the wire taut, deliberate, almost like a guide through the concealed spaces. Returning to the corridor, Harper noticed a small service hatch at floor level. The latch was slightly bent, marks along the edge faint but deliberate. He lifted it, revealing a shallow cavity beneath the tiles. Inside lay fragments of torn paper, each smudged and darkened at the edges. One bore a symbol he recognized from previous clues, a triangle with a single horizontal line beneath it. Another fragment contained the time 2:14, scrawled in neat, precise handwriting. He pressed his gloved hand to the floor, feeling a faint vibration, likely the hum of machinery nearby, but it gave him a strange sense of connection, as if the building itself was pulsing with subtle activity. The corridor stretched ahead, silent, every detail amplified. The faint scratch of metal against tile, the whisper of air through the vent, the uneven placement of scuff marks and dust disturbances. A narrow doorway at the end led into what appeared to be a small utility room. The air smelled faintly of oil and cleaning solvents. On a low shelf, Harper found a series of glass jars, each containing a granular substance, some fine, some coarse, and each marked with times and numbers that corresponded to previous notes. The jars were arranged carefully, almost ceremoniously, as though each held significance beyond their obvious content. He lingered, tracing the sequence of markings, listening to the quiet hum of the building around him. Footprints, smudges, scratched surfaces, notes, symbols, wires, and time-stamped reminders, all layered together, forming an intricate pattern that whispered a methodical, deliberate presence. Harper exhaled slowly, aware of the patient, watchful rhythm embedded in the space, and knew that each careful discovery was a step deeper into the quiet, unhurried puzzle that the building had been keeping for itself. Harper descended the narrow corridor that led from the utility room toward the sub-basement. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed intermittently, casting brief flickers across the walls. The floor was cold concrete, streaked with faint discolorations where water had seeped in and evaporated, leaving irregular patterns. A thin line of dust traced along the baseboards, broken at intervals by shallow smudges, barely perceptible fingerprints pressed with care. At the end of the hallway, a heavy metal door with peeling paint stood slightly ajar. Harper nudged it open, and a faint smell of damp earth and aged wood met him. Inside, the sub-basement stretched longer than he had expected, narrow rows of storage lockers lining either side. Most were locked, but one door was missing entirely, leaving an empty space where its interior was exposed. Inside, he found a stack of notebooks bound with twine, the pages yellowed, edges curling. Opening one carefully, Harper discovered a series of small diagrams, hallways, stairwells, apartments, each marked with faint scratches, arrows, and numbers corresponding to times. A recurring pattern jumped out: 213, 214, 215, 216. He traced the marks with his gloved finger, noticing tiny smudges along the margins, almost imperceptible, suggesting someone had handled the pages while planning or recording movement. A corner of the sub-basement was slightly darker, and as Harper approached, he saw a thin trail of fine powder along the floor, barely visible in the flashlight's beam. It led toward a low hatch in the wall. Kneeling, he lifted it carefully and found a shallow cavity, inside which lay several folded slips of paper. Each contained cryptic notes: third floor vent, observe the sequence, do not deviate. One slip had a tiny smudge of something dark along the edge. Harper pressed it gently between his fingers, noting its sticky, granular texture. The faint echo of dripping water drew his attention toward a far corner. A small pipe ran along the ceiling, and beneath it a puddle had collected. Harper knelt beside it and noticed faint footprints pressed into the thin layer of sediment along the edge, small, deliberate steps leading toward a service ladder. Each print stopped briefly, then resumed, suggesting a measured pace. Climbing the ladder, he entered a narrow service passage above the sub-basement. The air smelled faintly of oil and damp stone. Along the walls, faint scratches ran in parallel lines, almost like a code, barely noticeable unless traced carefully. Harper followed them to a small metal panel set flush with the wall. Pressing gently, it swung open on a hinge, revealing a shallow cavity containing a single envelope. Inside was a folded sheet marked with an array of symbols, triangles, arrows, and horizontal lines repeated in careful sequences. A corner was torn and darkened, as though handled often. Stepping back, Harper shined his flashlight along the passage. Dust had been disturbed in small, deliberate swaths, suggesting recent movement. Tiny fragments of paper clung to the floor, each bearing faint scrawled numbers and letters. Harper noted the precision of their placement, the consistency of markings, and the subtle alignment with patterns he had already seen in the apartment and on the roof. He continued down the passage, drawn to a faint glow emanating from beneath another door. The room beyond was small, filled with filing cabinets and stacked boxes. Harper approached one, sliding open a drawer to find folded photographs of stairwells and hallways, taken from angles that suggested careful observation. One image caught his eye: a fire escape, wet and glistening, with faint footprints leading toward a window he recognized from the balcony. A small desk near the window held notebooks open to pages filled with times and sequences, written in meticulous handwriting: 213, 214, 215. Harper ran his gloved fingers over the page edges, feeling the impressions of repeated handling. A faint, Granular residue along the margins matched the other subtle traces he had discovered throughout the building. The rain outside had eased further, leaving a thin mist over the streets below. Harper stood quietly, flashlight sweeping the room. Footprints, smudges, scratches, folded notes, symbols, wires, and powders all formed a rhythm, careful, deliberate, patient. Each subtle trace, every detail, suggested someone aware, deliberate, and watchful, threading their presence through the building's corners and corridors. Harper exhaled slowly, aware that each discovery only deepened the quiet, intricate mystery he had been following, the larger picture still hidden, just out of reach. Harper leaned against the edge of the desk, letting his mind trace the sequence of rooms, the subtle marks, the small fragments of paper, the scratches and residues he had found over days of careful observation. The pattern, once almost imperceptible, began to take shape in his memory, not as a dramatic narrative, but as a quiet choreography of routine and habit. He thought back to the times recorded over and over again. 2:13, 2:14, 2:15, 2:16. Each minute seemed deliberate, precise, almost ritualistic. And then he realized the disturbances, the scratches, the traces in the dust, the carefully folded notes, all converged around those narrow windows of time. Whoever had been moving through the building, leaving these marks, had not been hiding. They had been observing, recording, marking, leaving traces for someone else or perhaps for themselves. Harper returned to the apartment, moving slowly, methodically. He traced the scratches along the hallway, now seeing them less as threats and more as markers of attention. The vent in the corridor, the rooftop footprints, the small cavity in the sub-basement, they were all part of the same quiet, controlled system. Nothing had been random. Everything had a purpose. The apparent intrusions had not been violent, not chaotic. They had been deliberate, almost methodical exercises in careful observation. In the kitchen, he noticed the slightly moved rug and the faint powdery residue once more. He realized that the person who had been there had been moving silently, testing pathways, checking conditions, documenting without disrupting. The faint smudge on the journal, the tiny fragments of paper with the timestamps, the symbols repeated across the building, all pointed to someone meticulous, someone aware of every surface, every sound, every reflection of light. Harper's eyes settled on the balcony, the crate across the alley, the puddles reflecting neon light, the subtle imprint of footprints. They suggested presence, yes, but not harm. The person had been moving in the shadows, a careful observer. He walked to the living room, fingertips brushing along the edges of the photographs he had found. Each frame documented hallways, stairwells, and exits, a slow study of space and movement. And then it came together. The intrusions were not thefts, not attacks. They were rehearsals, small, repeated explorations of space, time, and sequence. The precise notes, the time-stamped slips, the symbols, they were a form of documentation, perhaps for a personal record, perhaps for a project, but never for violence. The apartment had been a stage, the building a quiet experiment in observation. Harper exhaled, allowing the tension to ease. He moved slowly through the rooms, touching the surfaces, noting the faint traces one last time. The scratches, the smudges, the footprints, they were all intentional, yes, but benign. The mystery had been built around the careful movements of someone methodical, perhaps solitary, who had preferred silence, shadow, and patience. Standing in the living room, he looked out the window. The city streets were empty now, wet and glistening, still humming faintly from distant traffic. The rain had stopped entirely, leaving only the quiet pulse of light on water. Harper felt the story settle around him, not with shock, not with confrontation, but with understanding. He gathered the notes and photographs carefully, leaving the apartment as he had found it, silent and still. The building seemed to exhale softly behind him, its hidden rhythms gently returning to normal. Harper walked down the stairwell, each step measured, aware that the sequence had ended not with violence, but with patience, observation, and quiet intent. Outside, the city was calm. The streets reflected the lingering glow of streetlights on puddles. Harper paused for a moment, listening to the distant hum of life, the soft drip of water from eaves, and felt the subtle clarity of the case settle around him. Everything that had seemed threatening now felt deliberate and contained, a series of small, precise movements that had revealed themselves not through chaos, but through observation, leaving only quiet understanding in their wake. Case 2. 911. Something's wrong with the oxygen tank. It's not working. First responders found the tank pressurized, but delivering no oxygen. Internal inspection later showed it had been filled with nitrogen, undetectable by smell, but incapable of sustaining respiration. The apartment was still. Light from the street lamps spilled through the blinds in long, thin slats, painting the walls with a muted grid of shadow and amber. Detective Harris moved carefully along the narrow hallway, his shoes silent against the linoleum. The smell of antiseptic lingered faintly, mingling with the metallic tang of the oxygen tank. The tank itself had been moved to the corner of the living room, now nothing more than a silent, pressurized cylinder, inert in the lamplight. He knelt and examined the regulator again. Nothing obvious. The nitrogen substitution had been invisible to the eye, odorless, and deadly only in its quiet absence of oxygen. He traced a finger along the tubing and noticed a small, almost imperceptible scratch near the connector, a shallow line, as if a tool had been used to open the valve at some point. Nothing else seemed disturbed. Harris rose and moved toward the kitchen. The apartment had the faint smell of old coffee, beans ground perhaps a day ago. The counter was immaculate, except for a small pile of pill containers stacked haphazardly near the sink. The labels were precise, dates and times aligned, but one container had a faint smear across its surface, a dull red that might have been dried from a fingertip or a drip of something more concerning. He made a mental note to test it later. Near the window, a birdcage sat empty, dust settling along the bars. He leaned in and saw tiny scratches along the bottom tray, faintly forming patterns that suggested more than just random wear. Perhaps the bird had been startled often, or perhaps it had been a side witness, left too long in the dark. The thought lingered, small but persistent, like the hum of an unseen machine in a quiet room. The hallway led to the bedroom, curtains drawn tight, but a sliver of moonlight caught on something at the bedside table. Harris bent to inspect, a photo frame, slightly tilted, showing a smiling family. The mother's eyes were sharp, the father's relaxed. But there was something else in the corner of the image, almost imperceptible, a shadow, a blur of movement that didn't align with anyone in the frame. He frowned, adjusting the angle. The blur was gone. He continued through the apartment, his eyes catching minor irregularities. A coaster with a faint ring of moisture, a pen left uncapped on the dresser, a single sock under the chair that seemed to belong nowhere. Each detail, small and mundane on its own, created a pattern of quiet disorder, subtle enough to avoid immediate notice but insistent when seen together. The phone on the counter vibrated lightly. No call, just a notification from earlier, a reminder for a medical appointment that had passed 2 days ago. Harris held the phone, thumb hovering over the screen, and noticed a shadow in the reflection of the glass, movement behind him. He turned slowly, but the hallway remained empty. Only the soft hum of the refrigerator filled the space. He opened the bedroom closet, careful not to disturb anything. The clothes were orderly, hung with deliberate spacing, yet at the back, a small box protruded slightly from the shelf. He reached in and pulled it out, a tangle of medical tubing, gloves, and a set of small, unmarked vials. The liquid inside was clear, the labels absent, but one had a faint residue, a reddish smear, echoing the mark he'd seen on the pill container. A breeze whispered through the slightly open window, carrying with it the faint scent of rain. Harris closed the window and stood for a long moment, letting the apartment speak to him in its quiet, disjointed language. Every detail was a thread, and he was only beginning to see the faint weave beneath the surface. Somewhere between the mundane and the deliberate lay the truth, though it refused to reveal itself fully. He moved back toward the living room, eyes catching a small envelope slipped beneath the couch cushion. Inside, folded neatly, were handwritten notes in a meticulous hand. The writing was calm, almost meditative, yet the words were cryptic. Dates, times, and a single line repeated, "The air we trust can betray us." He felt a chill, subtle but insistent, like the slow slide of a shadow across a wall. Outside, the rain began in earnest, drumming lightly against the windows. The apartment seemed to shrink inward under its sound, pressing every small irregularity into focus. Harris sat on the edge of the couch, notes and box in hand, listening to the quiet chaos of the space. Somewhere beyond these walls, the answers waited, slow and patient, and he would have to follow each tiny clue into the corners of a carefully constructed silence. The investigation was just beginning, and the apartment whispered in patterns too subtle for most to notice. A drip of water from the ceiling caught his eye, forming a perfect circle on the linoleum. Another was forming beneath it, aligning almost mechanically. He traced the path of the drops, the faintest echo of deliberate placement, as if the space itself wanted to communicate. Every step Harris took, every sound the apartment made, seemed to pull him deeper into its quiet, deliberate logic. And in that stillness, he felt the first weight of realization. Nothing here was accidental, and nothing lethal revealed itself in a rush. Everything waited, patient, hidden in plain sight. Harris left the apartment and stepped onto the narrow fire escape, the metal cold under his gloved hands. The city beyond was muted, washed in a sheen of wet asphalt reflecting the sparse glow of streetlights. Rain fell steadily, rhythmically, pattering against the ledges, and he noticed how the sound seemed to fill the gaps between thoughts, slowing them. From above, a neighbor's window flickered with movement, a shadow crossing behind drawn curtains. He made a note to speak with them later, wondering if any sound had carried through the thin walls of the building. The lobby was empty, damp from the rain tracked in by shoes. He ran a finger along the brass directory panel, noticing a faint smudge beneath one of the tenant names, a mark almost invisible unless you looked closely. Small irregularities marked the building itself. A light bulb in the hallway flickered with an uneven rhythm. A step creaked slightly out of sequence, and the scent of damp paint lingered in corners where repairs had been haphazardly applied. Later, He visited a small cafe 2 blocks away, a place with low ceilings and narrow tables, where the smell of roasted beans mixed with the faint tang of cleaning solution. He ordered coffee, black, and took a seat near the window, tracing the pattern of raindrops sliding down the glass. Across the street, he noticed a maintenance shed with its doors slightly ajar. Inside, stacks of cylinders similar to the nitrogen tank sat in neat rows, some with scuff marks at their bases, as though handled often. He scribbled a note. The tanks were used in the building, but by whom and for what remained unclear. Back in the apartment building later that afternoon, he spoke quietly with the doorman, a man whose eyes seemed always half-lidded, as though the world had worn him down. The man mentioned deliveries, small packages arriving on irregular schedules, often late at night. Harris noted the times and the way the doorman hesitated, as though reluctant to recall them. There was nothing overtly sinister in the descriptions, but the subtle pattern of secrecy clung to the words, like dust in the corners. Harris returned to the apartment with a technician to examine the plumbing. The small utility closet revealed a faint scent of chemicals, almost imperceptible at first. A patch of damp near the floor hid a tiny perforation in a pipe, from which a slow drip had created a ring on the linoleum. The technician shrugged, suggesting a minor leak, but Harris's attention lingered on the shape of the stain, a perfect circle, almost geometric, as if measured and intentional rather than accidental. He wandered into the hallway, flashlights sweeping over the walls. A faint scuff mark along the molding caught his eye, thin and linear, barely perceptible. Running a gloved hand over it, he felt the subtle indentation, like something had been slid along the wall repeatedly. Could be furniture, he thought, or something else. The air seemed heavier near the mark, a subtle difference in temperature or humidity, the way some spaces retain a quiet weight after something unseen has occurred. That evening, he visited the local library, a small brick building with low shelves and polished wood floors. He sat in a corner near a window, tracing patterns of light as dusk settled outside. He leafed through building permits, delivery logs, and chemical purchase records. Most were mundane, but one document showed a small, local supplier had delivered nitrogen tanks in a manner inconsistent with their normal procedure, unlabeled, marked only with codes. The entry was so ordinary, almost bureaucratic, that it would have gone unnoticed by anyone skimming the page. Yet it hummed quietly in the back of Harris's mind, a small signal amid the static. Walking home, the streets slick and silent save for the occasional tire splash, he noticed a faint glint in a storm-drained grate, almost reflective. Kneeling, he peered in, but only darkness met his gaze. Still, something about the placement and timing felt deliberate. A discarded wrapper from a medical supply company lay nearby, wet and flattened. Nothing overtly incriminating, yet the small detail lodged in his consciousness, a pinprick of curiosity he could not ignore. Back in the apartment that night, he moved slowly through each room again, letting the space speak. The box of tubing, the scattered notes, the pill containers, they seemed almost to pulse faintly with intention. On the dresser, a faint ring of moisture appeared overnight, almost exactly where a small glass had been placed. Harris measured it carefully, noting how the droplets formed near perfect symmetry. From the corner of the living room, he noticed a faint draft, almost imperceptible, carrying the scent of rainwater mixed with metal. It seemed to originate from the slightly warped window frame. The hum of the building, pipes, vents, the settling of walls, filled the silence, each small sound amplified in the quiet. Harris exhaled slowly, letting the weight of the investigation settle around him. Each subtle clue, marks, smudges, smells, rhythms, added a layer to the unseen architecture of the case. And somewhere within it all, he sensed the truth waited, quiet, patient, and hidden in the smallest details. Nothing here demanded revelation. It insisted on observation, on attention to the minor irregularities that, strung together, might eventually map a pattern only he could perceive. Harris returned to the apartment building the following morning, the rain having stopped, leaving the streets slick and smelling faintly of wet asphalt and ozone. The sky was pale, a thin sheet of cloud stretching across the horizon. He moved slowly through the lobby, noting the faint impressions of wet footprints on the tile, erased in part, but still visible, leading toward the stairwell. He crouched briefly, tracing them with a gloved fingertip. The prints were small, precise, the kind left deliberately to avoid attention. He climbed the narrow staircase quietly, the sound of his steps muted by damp carpeting on the landings. On the third floor, he paused outside a door across from the apartment in question. The peephole was scratched lightly around the edges, almost imperceptibly, as though someone had tried to see inside without being seen. He pressed his ear to the door. The apartment beyond was silent, save for the distant hum of a radiator. Harris made his way down the hall toward the fire escape. At the corner near the stairwell, a small envelope had been wedged between the railing and wall. He picked it up carefully, opening it. Inside were several business cards, all from local delivery services. Most were unremarkable, but one was bent and stained with a faint, almost metallic residue. A note had been written across the back in tiny, careful handwriting. Wednesday night. Left. The simplicity of the message was unsettling, as though it was meant for someone who already knew exactly what it meant. Later, he walked to the nearby hardware store. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, and the scent of sawdust and oil lingered. He asked the clerk about nitrogen tanks and small oxygen regulators. The clerk, a man with soft eyes and slow movements, hesitated before answering. Some people buy them for medical purposes, he said quietly, then added, sometimes they come back for adjustments or repairs, unusual requests. Rare, but not impossible. Harris nodded, watching the way the man's hands lingered on the counter. Nothing in his tone indicated deception, but the pause felt deliberate, as if the clerk had been asked about this before or was warning someone he hadn't yet named. That afternoon, Harris visited a small, unremarkable laundromat a few blocks from the apartment. The room smelled faintly of detergent and damp clothes. Machines whirred quietly, and a single fluorescent tube flickered intermittently above the folding tables. On the wall near the detergent dispensers, a small piece of masking tape had been stuck with a barely legible scrawl, Tuesday p.m., clean before leaving. It seemed insignificant, but Harris paused, turning it over in his mind. Patterns in timing and minor details were beginning to emerge. They were the breadcrumbs he had learned to notice. He returned to the apartment as evening settled. The hallways smelled faintly of rain and dust. In the apartment, the box of tubing from the closet had been moved slightly, its lid now ajar. He knelt and examined the vials inside, noticing a faint residue around the rims, small enough to escape casual observation. One vial had a minuscule crack, just enough that it could leak if handled improperly. The apartment's stillness pressed in around him, each small sound, creaking pipes, the faint hum of the fridge, becoming a voice in the silence. Harris moved toward the window and noticed a subtle difference in the condensation along the glass. The upper corner had dried unevenly, forming a pattern that suggested something had been pressed against it recently, perhaps a hand or a small object. He ran his gloved fingers lightly across the glass, finding the faintest impression of pressure. From the bedroom, a soft draft carried in a new scent, something faintly chemical, almost sweet. He followed it to the air vent, removing the cover carefully. Inside, a thin layer of dust had been disturbed recently, and a small, folded piece of paper had been tucked into the corner. Unfolded, it contained a series of numbers, 11, 17, 23, and 2. No words, only numbers. He tucked the paper into his pocket, the sense of deliberate pattern growing heavier with each discovery. Later, as darkness fell, Harris wandered the neighborhood outside the apartment. Streetlights reflected off puddles, casting long, wavering shadows. At the edge of a narrow alley, a discarded glove lay flattened against the wet brick. He knelt, noticing faint smudges that led toward a set of dumpsters. A faint metallic scent hung in the air, lingering and subtle, as though someone had handled something recently. The traces ended abruptly, but the implication remained. Movement, deliberate, careful. Back inside the apartment, the faint hum of the building settled around him. Each small clue, the numbers, the markings, the subtle chemical traces, formed a lattice of quiet intention. Harris sat on the edge of the couch, listening to the apartment breathe, noting the way shadows pooled in corners, how reflections shifted in the window. The pattern was not yet clear, but the apartment itself seemed to whisper in a language of small disturbances, waiting for him to listen long enough to understand. Harris left the apartment building again, the evening air heavy with the scent of wet brick and the faint, lingering tang of ozone from the earlier rain. He walked slowly, letting his steps guide him past narrow alleyways and the quiet hum of the city. A low hum of a generator echoed from a nearby construction site, punctuated by the occasional clang of metal against metal. In the distance, the sound of a loose shutter flapping against a window broke the rhythm, drawing his attention. He made his way to a small park tucked between two old apartment blocks. The grass was slick with rain, blades bending under droplets, and the benches glistened faintly in the pale light of a single lamppost. He crouched near the edge of a flower bed, noticing a faint trail of soil disrupted along the border. Tiny fragments of broken glass sparkled among the dirt, almost invisible unless examined closely. He collected a few pieces, careful not to disturb the subtle pattern, and noted the trail led toward the park's perimeter, stopping abruptly where the pavement began. From the park, he continued toward an unassuming diner on the corner, its neon sign flickering gently. Inside, the smell of frying onions and coffee mingled with the faint, sharp odor of bleach. He took a booth near the back, eyes scanning the quiet patrons. A waitress moved between tables, her steps precise, her expression neutral. When she returned his quiet nod, she hesitated briefly, glancing toward the corner of the diner before continuing her work. Something in that hesitation caught him, an instinct honed by years of noticing the almost invisible. He ordered a black coffee and sipped slowly, letting the warmth settle into his chest. On the table beside him, a small sugar packet had fallen slightly askew, revealing a faint fingerprint in the powdered residue. It was smudged and partial, but the ridge pattern suggested careful placement rather than an accident. He folded the packet gently, tucking it into a paper envelope he carried for such observations. After the diner, he wandered down a side street lined with shuttered storefronts. The doors were painted in muted colors, some peeling at the edges. A faint smell of rust, and old paint drifted from one of the storage garages. Peering through the slightly warped glass of a window, he saw rows of metal shelving, boxes stacked meticulously. One box, in particular, had been moved recently, the imprint of a hand still visible in the dust along the edge. He made a mental note, curious if the pattern of movement inside these quiet, overlooked spaces connected back to the nitrogen tank. Back at the apartment later that night, he re-examined the bedroom closet. The small box of tubing and vials had been nudged slightly again, as though disturbed by unseen hands. He traced the edges carefully, feeling the subtle grooves where the lid had been lifted and replaced. Among the vials, one had a faint, oily sheen along its base, almost imperceptible in the dim light. It could have been residue from handling or something more deliberate. Harris moved toward the bathroom, the tiles cool under his feet. A thin film of water traced along the baseboard, forming tiny rivulets that led toward the drain. He knelt and ran a finger along the path, noting a faint streak of reddish-brown that seemed to appear and fade depending on the angle of light. He wiped a sample onto a cloth, careful not to smear it further. The scent was faint but unusual, metallic, almost imperceptible yet distinct against the background of dampness. He lingered in the living room, noting how the shadows pooled along the walls, shifting as the city lights outside flickered through the blinds. The box of notes, the pill containers, the subtle imprints on glass and furniture, they all seemed to form a lattice, intricate and deliberate. Harris reached for the small envelope from the vent with the numbers. He turned it over slowly, noticing tiny indentations along the edges, as if the paper had been folded and unfolded dozens of times, pressed carefully against some hard surface to leave a faint trace. A sudden knock at the door made him start, though the sound was soft, almost tentative. He approached slowly, hand on the doorknob. No one outside, only the faint echo of the city through the walls and the rhythm of his own breathing. Something had brushed past the threshold, or perhaps it was a trick of the wind. Harris returned to the window, watching the quiet street below. A recycling truck rumbled past, the noise fading quickly. Near the curb, a small puddle reflected the glow of a neon sign, catching a glint of something bright at its edge. He stepped closer, seeing a single metal washer, clean and out of place among the gravel and rainwater. He bent to collect it, turning it over in his hand. Its weight was ordinary, but its presence here was not. The apartment seemed to settle around him, each subtle movement, each faint sound, sharpening the stillness. The investigation had become a matter of noticing the small, deliberate disturbances in the otherwise mundane, the tiny imprints left by unseen hands, and the whisper of patterns in silence. Harris felt the weight of it pressing gently, insistently. The truth was here, but it would not announce itself. It would reveal itself in patience, in observation, in the quiet accumulation of details that most would overlook. Harris returned to the apartment the next morning while the streets were still damp from overnight drizzle. The air smelled faintly of wet asphalt and cold concrete. He carried a small notebook, a flashlight, and a sealed evidence envelope with the pieces he had collected over the past days. The building was quiet, the usual low hum of its pipes and distant traffic providing a subtle, constant backdrop. He paused outside the apartment door, noticing a faint discoloration along the lower corner of the frame. It was nearly imperceptible, a slightly darker streak against the paint, as though someone had leaned or pressed against it repeatedly. He knelt and traced it lightly with a gloved fingertip, feeling the subtle texture of worn layers. A small flake of paint lifted under his touch, revealing a pale primer beneath. Inside, the apartment felt colder than usual. The windows were streaked with condensation, and the smell of faintly musty air lingered, muted by the circulation of the heater. Harris moved slowly through the living room, sweeping his flashlight across surfaces. On the coffee table, a small puddle had formed overnight, the result of condensation from a glass left in the same spot as before. He noted that the shape of the mark was unusual, almost triangular, and the edges were sharply defined, suggesting something heavy had pressed into it. He moved to the kitchen. A single drawer, slightly ajar, revealed a neat row of knives. One, smaller than the rest, had a faint smear near the tip. He paused, careful not to disturb it, and retrieved a swab. The scent was faint, metallic, lingering in a way that seemed deliberate. On the counter beside it, a teacup had been placed at an odd angle, a slight chip on the rim catching the light. It seemed unremarkable, but the tilt suggested it had been handled deliberately, perhaps tested for balance or weight. Harris went to the bedroom. The curtains were drawn tight, yet a faint line of light slipped under the hem, catching on something near the nightstand. A thin piece of paper protruded from the base of the lamp. He retrieved it carefully, an index card with a series of letters, scribbled in neat, precise handwriting. E, K, R, B. No context, no numbers, only letters. He turned it over several times, the indentation of the pen deep enough to feel the raised impressions along the surface. The closet drew his attention again. The box of vials and tubing had shifted slightly overnight. He opened it carefully, noting that one vial had a subtle smear along the cap, almost invisible unless held to the light. Beneath it, a small slip of paper had been tucked in. On it, tiny symbols, almost like shorthand, lined the page. Some resembled letters, others simple geometric shapes, a triangle, a small circle, a short line. Harris noted them meticulously. He lingered near the window, watching the neighborhood wake slowly. Across the street, a small dry cleaner opened its metal gate with a groan. A delivery van idled briefly outside, its engine humming low. Harris saw a hand briefly appear at the driver's side window, reaching for something small and metallic, though the person remained out of sight. The motion was fleeting, almost unnoticeable, yet he noted the pattern. Small movements in quiet spaces, deliberate, almost rehearsed. In the hallway outside the apartment, he noticed the faintest scent of ammonia, subtle but distinct. He followed it to the stairwell, where a small puddle had formed near a corner of the landing. Tiny footprints, barely visible, led toward the fire escape. He knelt to trace them, noting the spacing and depth. They belonged to someone small or light, perhaps careful to avoid leaving a heavier impression. The prints stopped abruptly, leaving only the pattern of water evaporating on the worn metal steps. Later, he walked to a nearby storage facility. Rows of units stretched into dim light, the air thick with the smell of cardboard, dust, and old wood. He had a key to one unit used by the apartment tenant for small storage. Inside, the space was neat, almost sterile. Metal shelving held boxes labeled in precise, handwritten script, tools, supplies, miscellaneous. A faint metallic smell lingered around one shelf. Harris ran his gloved fingers across the boxes, feeling subtle indentations on the tops where something had been pressed down. On the floor, tucked under a plastic bin, he discovered a small, folded piece of aluminum foil. Unfolded, it revealed a faint, sticky residue along one edge, nearly invisible to casual observation. He bagged it carefully, noting the weight, texture, and smell. Each detail, however small, seemed deliberate, almost ritualized, a series of tiny actions intended to go unnoticed but leaving subtle traces. Returning to the apartment that evening, Harris moved deliberately, letting the silence guide him. The faint hum of pipes, the occasional creak of settling walls, the shift of shadows in corners, they all seemed to participate in a slow, deliberate rhythm. He lined up his notes, observations, and collected traces along the table. Each mark, each imprint, each chemical hint, and subtle disturbance formed a lattice he was only beginning to perceive. The apartment, the neighborhood, the quiet streets, they spoke in whispers. Harris listened carefully, tracing the outlines of patterns, following the smallest irregularities. Somewhere, in these minute, deliberate details, a careful structure of intent existed. He did not yet understand it fully, but he felt the weight of its presence, patient, unhurried, waiting to be uncovered one subtle clue at a time. Harris left the apartment building just as dusk began to settle over the city, the horizon a faint wash of violet and gray. The sidewalks were slick from a late afternoon drizzle, reflecting the amber glow of streetlights in thin, uneven ribbons. He walked slowly, letting his senses absorb the quiet shifts in the city, the distant rumble of a subway, a dog barking somewhere down a side street, the faint hiss of tires over wet asphalt. Each sound seemed magnified against the subdued rhythm of evening. He paused outside a small pharmacy tucked between a laundromat and a shuttered bakery. The front window had condensation along its lower edge, and a tiny smear of dried residue caught the light. Harris crouched to inspect it, a faint streak, reddish-brown, almost imperceptible unless examined closely. He noted the angle of the smear, the subtle way it curved, as though the object that left it had been carried deliberately rather than dropped. Inside, the pharmacy smelled faintly of rubbing alcohol and old paper. He approached the counter quietly, noticing how a single bottle of antiseptic solution had been nudged slightly off the edge of the shelf. The pharmacist, an older woman with gray-streaked hair, moved slowly to retrieve it. Harris asked about recent deliveries of nitrogen tanks or oxygen regulators. She hesitated, her fingers pausing mid-motion. Occasionally, yes, she said, voice low. People come late at night, or sometimes request odd quantities. Nothing else unusual. Her eyes flicked briefly toward the door, then back to her hands. Harris made a mental note of the hesitation. He left and wandered toward an abandoned warehouse a few blocks away. The windows were dark, some panes cracked, allowing faint drafts to enter. Inside, the air was thick with dust and a faint, metallic odor. He stepped carefully over broken floorboards, listening to the echo of his boots. In a corner, he found a stack of wooden pallets, one leaning against the wall at a slight angle. Behind it, a small puddle of water had collected, with a few flecks of rust-colored residue floating on the surface. He knelt to examine it, brushing a fingertip across the edge. It felt sticky, as though something had spilled and partially dried. He noticed the faintest trail of footprints leading toward the back exit, small and shallow, almost hidden in the dust. They ended abruptly at a pile of crumpled tarps, disturbed slightly as if someone had moved them recently. Harris adjusted the flashlight, illuminating the corner. Beneath the tarps, he found a bundle of tubing similar to what had been in the apartment, carefully coiled and tied. He bagged it mentally as a potential lead, noting the precision of the arrangement. Later, he visited a narrow alley behind a dry cleaner. The bricks were damp, moss forming along the edges of the pavement. A faint chemical odor hung in the air, almost sweet, subtle enough to be missed by someone not paying attention. Harris noticed small scratches along the metal dumpster lid, parallel and evenly spaced, suggesting repeated handling. He crouched, inspecting the ground. Tiny fragments of what looked like packaging tape clung to the asphalt, the corners curling slightly from moisture. He returned to the apartment just as night fell fully, the streetlights casting long, uneven shadows through the blinds. Inside, the bedroom closet had shifted slightly again. The box of vials and tubing now rested at a slight diagonal. He opened it carefully and noted that one vial had a minuscule crack near the cap, the residue along the edge now slightly darker in the dim light. He traced the faint geometric symbols on the slip of paper beneath it, studying the triangle, circle, and short line, trying to discern a pattern he could not yet name. The living room felt unusually quiet. The city's hum outside had diminished, leaving only the soft buzz of the refrigerator and the subtle creak of the walls. Harris moved to the window, brushing his fingers along the condensation. Near the corner, a faint handprint remained, smudged slightly, almost imperceptible. He studied it in silence, noticing how the pressure had been distributed, the subtle arcs along the wrist and fingers. It suggested a deliberate touch, not casual contact. On the floor, he found a single washer he had picked up outside earlier, now sitting in a faint circle of condensation where he had placed it. Its position seemed deliberate, a quiet signal amid the small disturbances of the apartment. He moved it slightly, noting how it caught the light, then returned it to its original spot, aware that every motion he made here left subtle impressions, adding to the apartment's language of small signs. Harris sat on the edge of the couch, listening to the apartment breathe around him. Pipes hummed softly. The faint draft through the window stirred the papers on the nightstand, and the shadows pooled and shifted with the city's distant glow. Each clue, each disturbance, each faint trace seemed to pulse with intention. He traced the connections slowly in his mind. The nitrogen tanks, the chemical residues, the precise smears, the unusual timing of deliveries, the patterns of symbols. The picture remained incomplete, but the weight of deliberate action pressed gently and persistently. He allowed himself a long breath, letting the apartment's silence fill him. Somewhere in these small, overlooked details, the framework of the truth existed, quiet, patient, and unhurried, waiting for him to perceive it fully, one subtle discovery at a time. Harris left the apartment early the next morning, the streets still damp from the previous night's drizzle. The air carried the faint, clean scent of wet concrete, mingled with the subtle, lingering odor of exhaust from vehicles long gone. He walked slowly, letting his steps guide him past narrow alleys and the muted hum of early traffic, noticing the small details he might have missed before, a faint streak of mud on a curb, the uneven tilt of a fire hydrant, a single glove lying abandoned against a lamppost. He stopped at a small stationery shop he had passed many times but never entered. Inside, the scent of paper and ink hung thick, mixing with the faint tang of rubber from the shelves' edges. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with a steady, careful manner, looked up as Harris approached. He asked quietly about unusual shipments or requests for medical forms and vials. The man paused, dusting his hands on a cloth, then nodded slowly. "Occasionally someone comes for specific forms," he said. "Nothing illegal, just particular. Late at night, usually. They ask for care instructions, sometimes for precise measurements. Odd, but not suspicious to most." Harris moved closer to the counter, glancing at a small stack of envelopes. One had a faint crease across the corner, and a tiny smear of a dark residue lingered along the edge. He noted the shape and texture, careful not to disturb it, and tucked the observation into his mental ledger. Later, he wandered through a narrow passageway behind the shop. Trash bins lined one side, the metal lids streaked with rust, and a thin layer of moisture clung to the pavement. A faint chemical smell, sweet and metallic, hung in the air. He knelt to inspect a small puddle near the corner, noticing tiny flecks of material floating on the surface, irregularly shaped and partially submerged. It was similar to what he had seen in the abandoned warehouse days earlier. He collected a sample carefully, keeping it separate for later analysis. The trail of subtle irregularities led him toward a small storage locker facility a few blocks away. Rows of metal doors reflected the dim light of street lamps, the air heavy with dust and a faint scent of wood and rust. Harris inserted the key into one unit and turned it slowly. Inside, the space was neat, almost sterile. Metal shelving held cardboard boxes, some labeled in a precise, almost clinical hand, supplies, tools, miscellaneous. He noticed that one box, slightly ajar, had a faint fingerprint along the edge, smudged in a way that suggested deliberate handling. Beneath it, a coil of tubing lay partially hidden. He traced it with his gloved fingers, noting its exact placement, the care taken to keep it orderly. He lingered in the dim light, eyes catching the subtle details. Scratches along the floor where boxes had been moved, a faint residue on the metal shelving, the way the air smelled slightly different in one corner, as though a small chemical spill had dried long ago. Every imperfection, every subtle sign, suggested action, intention, and repetition. Returning to the apartment, Harris paused outside the lobby. The doorman's eyes followed him briefly, then returned to a magazine. "Nothing unusual tonight?" Harris asked quietly. The doorman shook his head slowly. "All quiet. Just deliveries, odd hours sometimes, but nothing out of place." His voice was flat, but Harris noted the slight hesitation, the almost imperceptible catch in his throat. Inside the apartment, the bedroom closet drew his attention again. The box of vials and tubing had shifted slightly, as if someone, or something, had adjusted it overnight. He opened it carefully and noticed one vial with a faint, oily residue along the base. Beneath it, the small paper with geometric symbols, the triangle, circle, and line, had been nudged slightly, as if repositioned for easier viewing. He moved to the living room, brushing his gloved hand across the condensation along the window. A faint handprint remained near the corner, smudged but deliberate. He followed the trace carefully with his eyes, noting the angle of pressure, the subtle arcs along the fingers and wrist. It suggested someone had leaned briefly, perhaps to peer outside or reach for something on the sill. On the floor, the washer he had found earlier glinted faintly in the low light. He picked it up and examined it, noting subtle scratches along its surface, almost like tiny marks left from being carried or dropped carefully. He returned it to the same spot, aware that even this small movement altered the apartment's quiet pattern, a minor disturbance in a lattice of deliberate actions. He sat on the edge of the couch, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft creak of settling walls. Shadows pooled and shifted as the city's distant glow filtered through the blinds. Each minor clue, the chemical residue, the geometric symbols, the subtle smudges, the fingerprints, wove together, forming a lattice of quiet intention. Harris traced connections slowly in his mind, the picture incomplete but present in faint outlines. The case did not demand revelation. It required patience, attention, and the careful assembly of small, deliberate traces. In the quiet of the apartment, Harris felt the weight of the investigation pressing gently around him. The truth remained unseen, embedded in the subtle disturbances of space and time, waiting for the patient accumulation of observation to illuminate its pattern, one understated discovery at a time. Harris walked through the quiet streets early the next morning. A thin mist clung to the asphalt, curling around the bases of lampposts, and the faint metallic scent of lingering rain mixed with the earthy smell of damp leaves along the curbs. The city felt smaller in the fog, hushed, the usual distant hum of traffic muffled. He moved slowly, deliberately, noticing details he might have ignored on sunnier days. A single bicycle wheel leaning against a brick wall, scuff marks on the steps of a building he had passed countless times, a small puddle reflecting a neon sign from a shop long closed. He paused in front of a narrow, unremarkable antique store. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old wood and varnish, dust motes drifting in beams of morning light through the front window. The shopkeeper, a woman with careful hands and quiet movements, moved behind the counter, polishing a glass display case. Harris asked casually if she had seen anyone handling delicate instruments or small tanks recently. She shook her head slowly, then added, almost as an afterthought, though someone did come looking for glass tubing last night, late. Took several pieces, very precise in what they wanted. Harris stepped closer to the counter, noticing a small smear along the edge of one display shelf. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but the pattern suggested it had been handled carefully rather than accidentally. He made a mental note, cataloging it alongside the other traces he had collected. He left the store and wandered down a narrow alley he had never explored before, the walls damp, covered with faint streaks of moss and graffiti faded to pastel shades. A single puddle reflected a dim, flickering light from a broken lamp above. Harris knelt, tracing small footprints pressed into the wet cement. Small, deliberate, careful. They ended abruptly at a chain-link fence with a small gap near the bottom. Beyond, a service entrance to a low-rise apartment block opened onto a forgotten courtyard, littered with leaves and debris, smelling faintly of rust and wet wood. He paused at the courtyard, noticing how the air shifted slightly, carrying a faint chemical tang he had smelled before, subtle, almost imperceptible. Near the base of a drain pipe, a thin layer of residue collected along the edge of a puddle. He crouched, collecting a small sample carefully, noting the curve of the puddle's edge, the way the residue had pooled. It was deliberate, almost geometrical in its shape. Later, he visited a small workshop tucked into a quiet industrial block. The air was thick with the scent of machine oil and dust, fluorescent lights flickering overhead. Rows of metal shelving held carefully organized containers, some labeled, others not. He noticed one shelf with a faint trail of dust disturbed along the front edge, small scratches in the surface suggesting repeated contact with thin, pointed objects. A small coil of tubing rested atop the shelf, slightly offset, its placement meticulous. He traced it with gloved fingers, noting every bend, every crease, careful not to disrupt its arrangement. Harris returned to the apartment in the late afternoon. The hallway smelled faintly of damp paint and cleaning solution. In the bedroom, the box of vials and tubing had shifted again, subtly diagonal this time. One vial had a barely perceptible streak of residue along the base, catching the dim light in a way that suggested it had been turned deliberately. Beneath it, The slip of paper with geometric symbols had been nudged slightly forward, as if someone wanted it visible without being handled directly. He moved to the living room, brushing lightly across the condensation on the window. A faint, smudged handprint lingered near the corner, its edges blurred but intentional. He traced the shape with his eyes, noting the subtle pressure points along the fingers and wrist, the arcs that suggested deliberate placement. On the floor, the washer he had found outside earlier reflected the muted glow of the city lights, its scratches catching the light in small, precise lines. Harris lingered near the window, listening. The pipes hummed softly, the refrigerator emitted a low, steady buzz, and the faint creak of the walls seemed more pronounced in the quiet. Across the street, a single figure moved behind a curtain, almost imperceptibly, pausing as if watching or waiting. Harris noted the timing, the subtle repetition, the way small actions repeated in deliberate sequences. He returned to the bedroom closet, kneeling before the box of vials and tubing. One vial's cap had a faint impression along the rim, a mark left by repeated handling. The small paper beneath, covered in triangles, circles, and lines, seemed slightly smudged, the edges softened from being touched. Harris carefully rearranged the items to match the original layout, observing the apartment's subtle language of disturbances, and allowed himself a long breath. Everything here, every mark, every trace, every subtle shift, was deliberate. Each small clue, quietly layered across locations and objects, hinted at intention. The investigation moved not in leaps or sudden revelations, but in patient accumulation, each observation tightening the lattice of unseen actions. Harris felt the quiet weight of it settling around him, pressing gently, insistently, yet without urgency. The truth remained just beyond perception, waiting, patient, and meticulous in the small, deliberate movements that whispered through the spaces he moved through so carefully. Harris left the apartment before sunrise, the sky a thin, muted gray, the streets slick from overnight condensation. The air was damp, faintly metallic, carrying the subtle scent of wet leaves and asphalt. His footsteps echoed softly against the uneven pavement, a rhythmic accompaniment to the quiet of the awakening city. He paused at a corner where a small florist stall had been set up the night before, noticing that one pot of soil had been disturbed. The top layer shifted as if a hand had pressed briefly into it. He knelt and traced the edge of the imprint, noting the gentle arcs of pressure, then straightened, tucking the observation into his notebook. A few blocks away, an old laundromat had begun to hum quietly. Inside, the air smelled of soap, wet fabric, and faintly of mildew. Harris leaned against the counter, watching the machines turn slowly. Among the rows of tumbling laundry, he noticed a single sock, slightly discolored at the cuff, tangled with a thread that seemed out of place. He reached for it and found a faint trace of residue along the seam, sticky and almost imperceptible. He bagged it mentally, noting the smallness of the clue and the care it demanded to detect. He moved on to a narrow footbridge spanning a canal, the iron railing slick with dew. The water below reflected the gray sky, interrupted only by the occasional ripple of a passing fish or a faint draft of wind. Harris knelt at the edge, brushing his fingers along the rusted bolts holding the railing. A thin streak of a dark substance followed the edge of the metal where his fingers traced, a nearly invisible path leading toward the stairway at the bridge's end. The pattern suggested repeated contact, small and deliberate, and Harris studied it closely, noting the subtle variations in width and pressure. Later, He explored a quiet courtyard behind a row of townhouses. The bricks were damp, moss creeping along the edges, and the faint smell of old wood lingered from a forgotten storage shed tucked into one corner. He noticed a single drawer partially open in the shed, its front edge scratched in fine, parallel lines. Inside, a small coil of tubing lay neatly, tied with a thin string. The careful arrangement suggested repeated handling, precision in placement, and he traced the coil lightly with gloved fingers, noting every fold and tension point. Returning to the apartment, Harris paused in the stairwell, noticing how a thin streak of dust along the railing had been brushed away in one section. The pattern was subtle, the motion deliberate. On the landing, a small envelope rested atop the edge of the mail slot, partially hidden behind a faded leaflet. He picked it up, feeling a faint indentation in the paper, as though someone had written on it previously and pressed it against a hard surface. He opened it carefully to find nothing but a single, small circle drawn in the center of the page, nearly invisible without close inspection. In the apartment, the bedroom closet drew his attention again. The box of vials and tubing had shifted slightly, diagonal along the shelf. One vial bore a thin residue along its base, darker than before, catching the dim light of the lamp. The paper with triangles, circles, and lines had been nudged slightly forward, its edges curling faintly as if it had been handled recently. Harris traced the shapes carefully with his eyes, noting how the triangle seemed sharper, the circle more precise, the line straighter than before. He moved to the kitchen. The faucet had a faint drip, irregular, as if timed by the movement of air rather than gravity. A small smear along the edge of the sink caught the light, sticky and dark, nearly indistinguishable from dried watermarks unless examined closely. On the counter, a single cup lay at an odd angle, a small chip along its rim catching the light. Harris reached for it gently, noting how its placement suggested deliberate testing of weight or balance. The living room was quiet. Shadows shifted as the evening light changed, pooling in corners, highlighting small disturbances. A faint handprint on the window, a tiny scuff along the baseboard, the washer on the floor reflecting the dim glow. Harris sat on the couch, tracing the connections slowly. The residue, the symbols, the fingerprints, the careful displacement of objects across multiple locations. Each small, deliberate action seemed to communicate a pattern, subtle and patient, requiring observation and patience to detect. The apartment seemed to breathe around him, every sound, shadow, and trace a potential clue. Harris allowed himself to listen, to feel the weight of the investigation pressing gently. The truth remained hidden in the quiet movements, in the delicate lattice of intentional disturbances, waiting to be understood through the accumulation of subtle, painstaking discoveries. Harris left the apartment building just as the first thin fingers of dawn touched the streets. The light was gray and soft, fading the edges of buildings into subtle gradients, and the air carried a faint chill, mixed with the scent of wet asphalt and early morning dew. He moved slowly, taking a side street he rarely traveled, where the pavement was cracked and weeds crept through narrow fissures. A small puddle reflected the low light, and Harris paused to notice a thin smear along its edge, dark and sticky, almost invisible unless examined closely. A few blocks on, a small bookshop opened its shutters. The air inside smelled faintly of paper, dust, and varnish. Harris wandered through the narrow aisles, brushing fingertips along spines of old volumes. A shelf near the back seemed slightly misaligned. One row of books leaned farther than the rest. He tugged gently at a thin volume and discovered a folded slip of paper tucked behind it. On it were a few carefully drawn lines, 3 parallel, 1 angled sharply, too deliberate to be accidental. He noted the small, precise details, the subtle texture of the pencil on the aged paper. From there, he wandered down a narrow alley between a shuttered cafe and an old tailor's shop. The alley smelled faintly of rust and damp wood, the bricks slick with condensation. Near a dumpster, he noticed a faint, triangular residue on the ground. Kneeling, he traced the edges with gloved fingers. It looked like the impression of something small, round, pressed deliberately into the damp concrete. Tiny scuff marks led from it toward a fire escape ladder, ending at the base of the building where water had pooled. Later, Harris visited a quiet municipal storage area, a long, narrow hall lined with metal doors. The air smelled faintly of oil, dust, and faintly of something metallic, almost sweet. One unit caught his attention. The lock was new, shiny against the dull gray doors. Inside, neatly stacked boxes were labeled in a careful, deliberate hand. Tools, supplies, miscellaneous. A single box had been shifted slightly. Its lid bore tiny scratches along the edge, fine, parallel, and precise. Inside the box, a thin coil of tubing rested atop folded cloth, arranged in a way that suggested attention to detail, almost reverence. Returning to the apartment in the late afternoon, Harris paused in the stairwell. A faint dust trail along the railing had been disturbed, the swipe of someone's hand precise, deliberate. On the landing, a single envelope rested atop a mail slot. The paper was thin, almost translucent, with a faint circular indentation pressed into its center. Harris picked it up carefully, feeling the subtle texture, noting that it had likely been handled but left in place intentionally. Inside the bedroom, the box of vials and tubing had shifted again, a subtle diagonal this time. One vial bore a faint, oily residue along the base, darker than before. The slip of paper with geometric symbols had been nudged forward, its edges curling slightly, as though handled recently. Harris traced the triangle, circle, and line with his eyes, noticing minute differences. The triangle sharper, the circle more precise, the line straighter than the last time he examined it. In the living room, he noticed a faint smudge on the window, almost imperceptible. The washer on the floor reflected the dim light, its scratches subtle but deliberate, lines that caught the eye if observed carefully. A small handprint lingered near the corner of the window, smudged but intentional. Harris studied the pressure and arcs along the fingers and wrist, noting the careful placement, the way it suggested deliberate observation or action rather than casual contact. He moved to the kitchen. A faint drip from the faucet was irregular, the rhythm broken, almost deliberate. On the counter, a chipped cup lay at an odd angle, its position suggesting a subtle test of weight or balance. A small smear along the edge of the sink glimmered faintly in the low light, sticky and dark, reminiscent of residues he had seen in other locations. As evening settled, Harris sat on the edge of the couch, the apartment quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft creak of walls settling. Shadows shifted across corners and along the floor, catching subtle traces he had observed over the past days. Smudges, scratches, residues, and carefully arranged objects. Each small clue seemed to connect in an invisible lattice, patient, precise, and deliberate. He listened to the apartment breathe around him, feeling the slow weight of unseen intentions pressing softly against the spaces he moved through. Every subtle disturbance, every minor anomaly across different locations, hinted at something carefully orchestrated. Harris allowed the quiet to fill him, letting the accumulation of tiny observations form a pattern just beyond perception. The truth remained elusive, existing in the careful repetition of deliberate, understated acts, waiting for patient attention to reveal its shape. Harris stepped outside into the late morning fog, the city muted and softened under a pale gray sky. The sidewalks glistened with lingering moisture, and a faint chill clung to the air, carrying the smell of wet brick and distant exhaust. He walked slowly, deliberately, noting the subtle variations in the streetscape. A discarded shoe, scuffed and wet, leaning against a curb. A mailbox door slightly ajar, catching the reflection of light in a way that suggested recent handling. A thin streak of residue along the edge of a lamppost where rainwater had run unevenly. He found himself drawn to a small, narrow courtyard behind an old brick apartment complex. The space was overgrown with weeds and littered with fallen leaves, damp from the early fog. A rusted fire escape leaned against the wall, its bolts streaked with a faint, almost imperceptible dark residue. Harris knelt to examine the base, noticing small scratches along the metal plate where the ladder met the ground. The marks were subtle but repeated, as though something heavy or sharp had been moved across the same path multiple times. From the courtyard, he slipped into a nearby park, deserted at this hour. The grass was slick, dew heavy on the blades, and the faint scent of earth and wet foliage filled the air. Along the edge of a small pond, he saw a single leaf floating on the surface, its tip caught in a thin sheen of a dark, sticky substance. He reached down carefully, testing the residue with a gloved finger, noting its texture and faint metallic scent. A series of tiny footprints in the mud led toward a line of low shrubs, stopping abruptly where the ground had been disturbed, flattened in a small rectangular patch. Later, Harris visited a quiet corner of the city's public library. The smell of aged paper and polished wood enveloped the narrow stacks. He drifted along a row of shelves, eyes scanning for anomalies. A small notebook, slightly askew, rested behind a row of encyclopedias. Opening it revealed meticulous notes, geometric symbols, sketches of tubing, arrows, and lines, all drawn with precision. The edges of the paper were slightly curled, faint smudges along the margins suggesting careful handling. He traced the markings with his gloved fingers, noting the repetition of certain patterns and the subtle differences between entries. He left the library and wandered toward an abandoned textile warehouse on the edge of the district. The building smelled faintly of mold and rusted iron, windows cracked, letting in shafts of soft, diffused light. Inside, the floorboards creaked beneath his weight, and the air was thick with dust motes dancing in the light. A small pile of discarded fabric in one corner had been moved recently. Harris noticed faint lines of residue along the floor beneath it, a subtle, sticky trace that caught the light when he bent low. Along the wall, a coil of thin tubing rested neatly atop a pallet, tied with a length of string in a precise loop, suggesting deliberate arrangement. Returning to the apartment that evening, Harris paused in the hallway, observing faint scuff marks along the carpeted floor near the door. Inside, the box of vials and tubing had shifted yet again. One vial now bore a thin, darker line of residue along its neck. The paper beneath it, the one with triangles, circles, and lines, had been nudged slightly forward, the edges softened from handling. Harris traced the symbols carefully with his eyes, noting minute variations. The triangle sharper, the circle more perfect, the lines slightly longer than before. In the living room, the washer on the floor caught his attention. Scratches along its surface formed subtle lines, almost like a map if studied closely. A faint handprint lingered near the window, smudged but intentional, with arcs of pressure that suggested someone had paused briefly, observing, testing the space. On the kitchen counter, a single cup sat at a precise angle, its rim chipped, a small smear along the edge catching the soft lamplight. Harris moved slowly, quietly, observing the apartment as it seemed to pulse with unseen activity. Each mark, residue, smudge, and displaced object built upon the others, forming a quiet lattice of intention. He felt the weight of these small, deliberate traces pressing softly, insistently, against the stillness. The truth remained just beyond perception, hidden in the careful orchestration of subtle actions and repeated behaviors, waiting for him to uncover it one patient, deliberate observation at a time. Harris walked along a quieter stretch of the city, where the streets were lined with narrow townhouses and the early morning fog lingered stubbornly in the corners. The pavement glistened faintly, reflecting the soft light of street lamps still burning, and the air carried the faint, metallic tang of lingering dew. A narrow service alley between two buildings caught his attention. The bricks were streaked with dark residue where rainwater had run, and he paused to examine a single set of scuff marks near a dumpster. They were shallow, deliberate, leading toward a small, rusted gate at the alley's end. Beyond the gate, a hidden courtyard opened up, overgrown with weeds and littered with fallen leaves damp from the fog. Harris knelt to examine a faint impression along the ground, triangular, almost geometric, pressed into the soft mud. Nearby, a discarded length of tubing lay partially hidden beneath a pile of wet leaves, its coils neat and precise. He picked it up carefully, feeling the faint stickiness along the surface and noting the subtle variations in tension where it had been handled before. He wandered into a small cafe tucked into the corner of the street, its windows fogged and dim. The air smelled faintly of roasted beans and lingering cleaning solution. A lone barista moved silently behind the counter, polishing cups with careful attention. Harris asked quietly if anyone had been asking about unusual supplies, vials, tubing, or precise measurements. The barista shook her head, then hesitated. Though, she said softly, someone did come yesterday late, asking about cleaning supplies in very specific amounts. Seemed exacting. Left quickly, didn't buy much. Harris noted the detail, small but deliberate, and left the cafe, his steps echoing lightly in the empty street. Later, he explored a narrow corridor of an old municipal building, the air thick with dust and the faint smell of aged paper. Metal shelving lined the walls, and Harris noticed that one shelf, slightly crooked, had small scratches along the edge, parallel and precise. A small cardboard box on the shelf had been moved recently. Inside, coils of thin tubing lay carefully tied, almost ritualistically, atop folded cloths. He traced the coil with gloved fingers, noting every crease and bend. Returning to the apartment, the hallway smelled faintly of damp paint and cleaning fluid. On the landing, a small envelope rested along the edge of the mail slot, a faint indentation pressed into the center of the paper. Harris picked it up carefully, noting the texture of the thin sheet and the subtle signs of handling. In the bedroom, the box of vials and tubing had shifted again, slightly diagonal on the shelf. One vial had a dark, oily residue along the base, catching the muted light. The slip of paper with triangles, circles, and lines had moved slightly forward, its edges curling faintly, suggesting recent handling. In the kitchen, the faucet dripped irregularly, the droplets uneven, almost deliberate. A chipped cup rested at a precise angle on the counter, a small smear along its edge faintly catching the lamp's glow. Harris traced it lightly with gloved fingers, noting how its placement mirrored other subtle disturbances he had observed. In the living room, the washer on the floor reflected the dim light, its surface scratched in faint, deliberate lines. A faint handprint lingered near the window, smudged but intentional, the pressure points along the fingers suggesting someone had paused briefly, testing the space. Shadows pooled along the corners of the room, shifting as the light changed, revealing subtle disturbances, smudges, scratches, residues, and carefully placed objects. He sat on the couch, listening to the apartment settle, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the quiet creak of the walls, the faint echo of distant traffic. Each small, deliberate trace seemed to accumulate, forming a lattice of intention. Harris allowed himself to notice the faint patterns connecting locations, residues, and objects. The truth remained just out of reach, hidden in the patient repetition of understated acts, waiting for observation and slow, careful assembly to reveal its shape. As evening fell, he moved toward the window, peering out at the quiet streets. Across the way, a shadow shifted behind a curtain, still and deliberate. Harris watched, noting the timing, the repeated hesitation, the subtle actions that suggested observation as much as concealment. Every minor disturbance, every careful placement, every faint trace became part of the quiet pattern. The case did not demand revelation. It demanded patience, attention, and the careful collection of whispers left in the spaces between ordinary movements. Harris left the apartment building just before dawn, the city unusually still, shrouded in a gray mist that blurred the edges of buildings and muted the sounds of traffic. The sidewalks were slick, reflecting the dim glow of streetlights that had not yet shut off, and the faint scent of wet brick and exhaust lingered in the cool air. He moved slowly, deliberately, down a narrow lane he rarely took. A small patch of dirt along the curb had been disturbed, the edges pressed flat, almost like the outline of a small object. He knelt, tracing it lightly with gloved fingers, noting the subtle arc where the material had been pushed aside and the faint residue clinging to the damp soil. He wandered toward an overlooked community garden tucked behind a chain-link fence, where the leaves of kale and chard glistened with morning dew. Harris noticed that one of the raised beds had soil slightly uneven, a series of thin, shallow impressions pressed into it. The marks were too deliberate to be from normal gardening. Nearby, a small glass jar lay tipped on its side, a faint streak of oily residue running down its side. He picked it up carefully, examining the faint smell of metal and something sweet, almost imperceptible. A few blocks on, he found an old, abandoned tailor's workshop. The air was heavy with the smell of fabric and dust, and the windows were streaked with condensation. Rows of spools of thread were stacked along shelves, some knocked slightly out of line. Harris leaned close to one shelf and noticed a faint, fine scratch along the wood, running diagonally in a careful pattern. A single pair of scissors rested atop a fabric bolt, positioned with unusual precision. He traced the scissors' edge lightly, noting tiny smudges along the handles, fingerprints worn faint, deliberate. He paused by a narrow bridge over a shallow canal, the water calm and dark, reflecting the dim morning light. A small ripple disturbed the surface where a single leaf had caught on a jagged stone. Harris knelt and noticed a faint, sticky residue along the edge of the stone, a line that suggested repeated contact with a narrow object. Tiny footprints in the mud led toward a side alley where the faint odor of chemicals hung in the air, metallic and subtle. Later, Harris returned to the municipal library, a quiet corner stacked with old journals and blueprints. The air smelled faintly of paper and varnish. In a narrow aisle, he found a small notebook wedged behind a row of reference books. Its pages were filled with symbols, geometric shapes, and lines drawn meticulously. He traced the shapes carefully, noticing subtle differences from the symbols he had observed before, the angles sharper, the spacing more exact. The edges of the paper bore tiny smudges, consistent with careful handling. Back at the apartment, Harris moved through the rooms slowly, noting subtle changes. In the bedroom, the box of vials and tubing had shifted again, slightly rotated on the shelf. One vial had a darker streak along the side, faintly reflective in the dim lamplight. The slip of paper with triangles, circles, and lines had moved forward, edges curling gently. In the kitchen, the faucet dripped irregularly, the droplets uneven, almost deliberate, and a chipped cup sat at a precise angle on the counter, a small smear along its rim. In the living room, the washer's surface caught the muted light, faint scratches forming lines that seemed intentional. A handprint lingered near the window, smudged but deliberate, arcs of pressure along the fingers suggesting measured placement. Shadows pooled in corners, shifting subtly with the changing light, revealing minor disturbances, residue, scratches, displaced objects, and faint smears. Harris lingered near the window, watching the quiet street below. Across the way, a curtain shifted, a shadow moving with care and intent. He noted the pause, the repeated subtle gestures, the stillness that carried its own weight. Each minor disturbance, every residue, every carefully placed object seemed part of a patient, deliberate pattern. The apartment, the alleys, the courtyard, the workshops, all whispered of unseen hands shaping the space, leaving messages only visible to attentive eyes. Harris felt the weight of these traces pressing softly, insistently, against him, demanding patience, careful observation, and quiet reflection. The truth remained just out of reach, present in the quiet, deliberate acts that had yet to reveal themselves fully. Harris walked along the back streets of the city as morning thickened into a pale, colorless light. The fog had begun to lift, leaving the pavement damp and shiny, the air carrying the faint odor of wet iron and old wood. He turned down a narrow lane that ran behind a row of shuttered workshops. The bricks darkened with moisture and streaked with faint residues that caught his eye. One smudge, almost imperceptible, traced a jagged line across a low wall. He crouched, brushing lightly with gloved fingers, noting the way the pattern curved and then stopped abruptly, as though the hand that left it had paused, then withdrawn. He passed a small, hidden parking lot tucked behind an old corner bakery, the asphalt cracked and littered with fragments of glass and dried leaves. Near the edge, a single shopping cart rested against a fence, its wheels aligned perfectly parallel to the lines in the concrete. Harris crouched to examine them, noticing faint scratches along the metal frame, subtle and precise, as if something heavy had been dragged along the same path repeatedly. He traced the scratches with a gloved fingertip, the residue slightly sticky under his touch. Across the street, an abandoned car repair shop sat with its doors half open, letting in the soft morning light. Inside, The smell of motor oil and rust was thick, and dust motes swirled in the weak shafts of illumination. Harris stepped carefully across the uneven floor, noting a small puddle near the workbench, darker at the edges, almost black. Leaning over it, he saw faint, circular impressions in the dust along the surrounding tiles, tiny enough to suggest a small instrument or container had been placed there repeatedly. A coil of thin tubing lay coiled atop a bench, tied in a precise loop, its edges pressed flat by careful handling. Later, he wandered into a public park, quiet except for the rustle of leaves and the occasional breeze. A small fountain sat at the center, the water stagnant and lined with algae. Harris knelt at the edge, noticing a thin streak of a dark, sticky substance along the stone lip, forming a subtle line from the fountain's edge toward the nearby shrubs. Tiny indentations in the soil, almost symmetrical, suggested repeated placement of small objects or careful footwork. He followed the trail to a low stone wall, where a single leaf rested, pressed flat with a dark residue along its tip, nearly invisible against the damp stone. By afternoon, he returned to the apartment, the hallway quiet and still. On the landing, a small envelope rested atop the mail slot, its edges curled slightly from handling, the center marked with a faint indentation. In the bedroom, the box of vials and tubing had moved again, rotated just slightly. One vial bore a thin, dark streak along the base, catching the light softly. The slip of paper with triangles, circles, and lines had shifted forward once more, edges curling as though touched gently but recently. In the kitchen, the faucet dripped in an irregular rhythm, droplets falling unevenly into the sink, and a chipped cup sat at a deliberate angle on the counter. Harris noted the faint smear along its rim, the residue almost imperceptible in the dim light. In the living room, the washer's surface reflected a muted glow from the lamp, fine scratches forming delicate lines. A handprint lingered near the window, smudged, arcs of pressure carefully placed. Shadows pooled in corners, shifting with the waning light, revealing subtle disturbances, displaced objects, faint residues, and minor scratches along the floorboards. Harris moved slowly through the apartment, allowing himself to notice the small, deliberate patterns that emerged across different rooms and locations. Each mark, smudge, and subtle shift carried intention, forming a quiet lattice of activity, patient and precise. As evening settled, he watched from the window. Across the street, a shadow lingered behind a curtain, motionless but observing, a stillness that felt deliberate. The city hummed softly around him, and he realized that the truth was present in these faint, patient movements, hidden in the quiet orchestration of small, deliberate acts. He breathed slowly, letting the weight of these observations settle, knowing that the pattern was there, just beyond reach, waiting to be understood. Harris left the apartment building just as the last hints of daylight faded behind the city skyline. The streets were quiet, almost unnaturally so, the faint hum of distant traffic muffled by the early evening mist. The air carried a subtle scent of wet concrete and decaying leaves, the kind of smell that seemed to cling to your clothes. He turned down a narrow alley he had noticed before, the walls streaked with old grime and faint, irregular stains. Near a corner, a small puddle reflected the dim glow of a street lamp, its surface broken by a single smear along the edge, dark and sticky, barely visible. He followed the alley to a forgotten courtyard behind a row of brick townhouses. The ground was uneven, littered with debris and puddles that mirrored the surrounding buildings. Harris crouched to examine a series of tiny depressions pressed into the soft earth. Triangular, shallow, deliberate. A coil of thin tubing rested nearby, tucked beneath a discarded newspaper. He lifted it carefully, feeling the faint tackiness along its surface and noting the way it had been looped with precision. Further down the street, he came to a small, abandoned warehouse. The doors hung half open, letting in streaks of fading light. Inside, the smell of rust and dust was thick. He stepped lightly across the floorboards, noting tiny scratches along the metal supports and beams, fine lines that ran parallel in a way that suggested repeated, careful contact. A workbench at the back held several small containers, some tipped slightly, others aligned with painstaking precision. One jar bore a faint, oily streak, dark along the edge, catching the dim light. Later, he wandered into a quiet section of the city's public garden, mostly empty at this hour. The grass was damp, the scent of earth rich and strong. Near a low stone wall, a single leaf lay pressed flat, edges darkened by moisture, faint residue along its tip. Harris knelt and traced the leaf lightly, noting subtle impressions in the soil beneath it, tiny, deliberate, repeated in a careful rhythm. Footprints led away toward a cluster of hedges, flattened in a small rectangle as if someone had knelt or crouched there. Returning to the apartment in the early evening, Harris paused on the landing. A small envelope rested against the doorframe, faintly indented in its center. In the bedroom, the box of vials and tubing had shifted slightly again, one vial now bearing a faint dark streak along its base. The slip of paper with triangles, circles, and lines had nudged forward, edges curling as if recently handled. In the kitchen, the faucet dripped unevenly, droplets falling at irregular intervals. A chipped cup rested at a deliberate angle on the counter, a faint smear along its rim catching the low lamplight. Harris traced it gently with his fingers, noting its precise positioning relative to other small disturbances he had observed before. In the living room, the washer on the floor caught a faint reflection, scratches forming subtle, deliberate lines. A handprint lingered near the window, arcs of pressure suggesting measured placement, smudged but unmistakable. Shadows shifted softly in the corners of the room, revealing minor disturbances, residue, scratches, displaced objects, all small and deliberate. Harris moved slowly, observing the apartment in quiet increments. Each mark, each smear, each displaced object seemed part of a patient, deliberate pattern, forming a lattice of intention across multiple locations. From the window, he watched the street below. Across the way, a curtain shifted, a shadow lingering behind it, motionless but alert. The city exhaled softly around him, and he felt the weight of the faint, patient traces pressing gently, insisting upon notice. The pattern remained elusive, yet undeniable, its quiet orchestration waiting to be discerned, step by careful step. Harris lingered by the window long after the shadow across the street had disappeared, letting his mind trace the day's quiet discoveries. Each residue, smear, and subtle disturbance replayed in his memory, like a soft, persistent echo. The tiny scratches on the warehouse metal, the faint oily streaks on vials, the irregular drips in the kitchen, the footprints pressed into damp soil. They were all small pieces of a larger design, patient and deliberate, but not chaotic. He thought of the bookshop, the folded slip of paper with its geometric lines, the carefully drawn notebook in the library, the precise loops of tubing left in the abandoned workshop. The realization came slowly, without urgency, like the fog lifting from a quiet street. The person responsible had not acted out of anger or whim. Everything was measured, careful, almost ritualistic. Each minor disturbance, each alignment of objects, spoke of method, of planning, of control over small, precise variables. Returning to the apartment, he walked through each room with soft, attentive steps. The box of vials and tubing, the paper with its triangles and circles, the chipped cup on the counter, they had all been touched, adjusted, and repositioned with intent, but there were no signs of struggle, no frantic marks. It became clear that the incidents were isolated, controlled, and indirect. The nitrogen-filled tank, the small substitutions, the slight manipulations, they were intended to create subtle, undetectable risk rather than immediate harm. Harris revisited the slip of paper from the bookshop and the symbols in the library notebook, comparing them slowly. Small alignments emerged, triangles and lines corresponding to the arrangements he had observed in the apartment and the warehouse, circles echoing the placement of vials and droplets. Each clue had been left, not carelessly, but as a faint signature, a quiet assertion of presence, a mark of careful observation. He thought of the footprints in the mud, the impressions pressed into the soil in the park, the residue on the stone fountain. Nothing suggested randomness. Everything pointed to someone meticulous, someone aware of each minor consequence and careful to avoid detection. The quiet disturbances across multiple locations formed a single thread when traced patiently. The person had monitored, adjusted, and guided, leaving faint traces but no overt confrontation. In the evening, Harris sat on the couch, the apartment dim and still. He traced each discovery in his mind, arranging them slowly, carefully, until a pattern emerged that was simple in its clarity. This had never been about sudden violence or dramatic acts. It had been about control, subtle influence, and unseen manipulation. The nitrogen tank, the displaced objects, the vials, they were all small instruments in a quiet design. He allowed himself a slow breath and a sense of closure. The risk had been real, deliberate, and measurable, but contained. The faint traces and the carefully orchestrated movements had revealed the character of the person responsible, meticulous, methodical, and deliberate. The story did not end in shock, but in understanding, the pieces settling gently into place. Harris rose, moving through the apartment one last time. The faint residues, the small smudges, the marks along the edges of furniture, all now read as quiet signals of intent, not chaos. Outside, the city exhaled into night, fog and streetlight blending softly. The investigation was complete in its quiet, reflective way. The truth had emerged gradually, in layers, through patient observation and gentle connections. The apartment felt still, safe, and fully understood. Each shadow, each whisper of evidence settled into its rightful place.